There are moments in history so large, so structurally complex, so saturated with human decision-making at every level from the Admiral's flag bridge to the engine room of a sinking destroyer, that they resist the usual vocabulary of military narrative. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is one of those moments, and I want to start by telling you something that most people who've heard the name don't fully grasp. This wasn't just the largest naval battle of the Second World War. It was the largest naval battle in the recorded history of human warfare, not by a narrow margin. By almost every measure, the number of ships, the tonnage engaged, the geographic area covered, the number of distinct engagements fought within the same operational window. Nothing before it or since has come close. More than 230 warships, roughly 190,000 naval personnel, an area of sea covering hundreds of thousands of square miles of the Western Pacific. 4 separate engagements fought simultaneously across distances that, on a map, look less like a single battle and more like a campaign. And yet, for all of that scale, the Battle of Leyte Gulf almost isn't taught. Not really, not with the depth it deserves. You'll find it mentioned in a paragraph of most Second World War histories. The naval battle that secured MacArthur's Philippines landing. The one with the big Japanese battleships. The one where something went wrong with American command coordination. But it turned out all right in the end. That summary isn't wrong, exactly. It's just missing almost everything that matters. It's missing the submarine contact in the pre-dawn dark of the Palawan Passage on the 23rd of October, 1944, where 2 American submarines tracked Kurita's center force by radar at 17 miles distance and sent the first contact reports that opened the battle. It's missing the Musashi, absorbing 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo hits across a single afternoon in the Sibuyan Sea before she finally capsized. It's missing the night action at the Surigao Strait, where old battleships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor aligned themselves in the dark and fired on Japanese battleships in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in human history. It's missing the morning of the 25th of October off the coast of Samar, when destroyer men charged battleships with weapons that couldn't realistically hurt them, because there was nothing else to do, and someone had to do it. I've been researching this battle for a long time. I mean that in the most literal sense. I've sat with the primary sources, the post-war interrogation transcripts, the after-action reports, the memoirs of men on both sides who lived through it and spent the rest of their lives processing what they'd seen. I've read Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, Thomas Cutler's detailed tactical account, C. Van Woodward's early post-war study, James Hornfisher's work on the Taffy 3 action. I've looked at the Japanese planning documents as they exist in translation, the post-war testimonies of Kurita and Ozawa and the officers of the Southern Force. And what I keep finding, what every fresh pass through the material reveals, is that the standard telling of this battle leaves out the parts that make it genuinely extraordinary. The standard telling gives you the outcome and skips the texture. This documentary is an attempt to restore the texture. Let me set the scene properly, because it matters. By October of 1944, the Pacific War had been running for nearly 3 years. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, had opened a conflict that stretched from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska to the coast of Burma, from the coral atolls of the Central Pacific to the jungles of New Guinea. The United States had spent those 3 years building a war machine of extraordinary scale. By the autumn of 1944, American shipyards were launching warships at a rate that Japan couldn't dream of matching. American factories were producing aircraft by the thousands each month, and the trained manpower that American military planners had been accumulating since 1942 was now fully deployed in a strategic offensive that was compressing Japanese-held territory from multiple directions simultaneously. The tide of the war, by any objective measure, had turned. What hadn't happened yet was the decisive engagement that would make the turning of the tide irreversible in the naval dimension of the Pacific. That engagement was about to happen. The Japanese military, by October of 1944, was in a situation that their own senior commanders understood with uncomfortable clarity. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of that year, the engagement American carrier pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though the nickname understates the human cost on both sides, had destroyed approximately 600 Japanese aircraft and eliminated carrier aviation as a viable Japanese offensive instrument. The island garrisons that had been written off one by one, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, had each consumed irreplaceable soldiers and supplies. The submarine campaign that American boats had been conducting against Japanese shipping throughout the war had, by the autumn of 1944, reduced Japanese tanker capacity to a fraction of what strategic planning had assumed would be necessary. Japan's oil reserves were running low. Their aircraft were running low. Their experienced pilots were gone. Their strategic options were narrowing week by week. And MacArthur's invasion force was now assembling off the coast of Leyte, in the central Philippines, preparing to land on the 20th of October. This is the context in which the Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership made the decision that produced the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, understood, as clearly as any man in his position could, that the war was going badly. He also understood that if American forces established themselves in the Philippines, Japan's supply lines from the oil fields of Borneo and the Dutch East Indies to the home islands would be effectively severed. Severed supply lines meant immobilized ships. Immobilized ships meant no fleet. No fleet meant no capacity to contest any subsequent American landing anywhere. Toyoda's assessment, stated explicitly in his post-war interrogations, was that if Japan lost the Philippines, there was no point in preserving the fleet, because a fleet without fuel was just expensive stationary steel. If the fleet was going to be lost anyway, better to spend it on a final attempt to change the course of the campaign. That logic, cold, clear, and in its own way courageous, produced Operation Sho-Gō 1. And Operation Sho-Gō 1, over 4 days in late October of 1944, produced the Battle of Leyte Gulf. What you're about to watch, or listen to, if you're settling in for the night, is the full story, all of it. The planning on both sides, the opening submarine contacts, the air battles in the Sibayan Sea, the night action at Surigao Strait, the desperate surface engagement off Samar, the carrier battle off Cape Engano, Halsey's controversial turn north, Kurita's even more controversial withdrawal, the first organized kamikaze attacks in history, and the long aftermath, the liberation of the Philippines, the final months of the Japanese Navy, the legacies of the commanders, and what the battle ultimately meant for the trajectory of the war and the shape of naval thinking in the decades that followed. We have 15 chapters and several hours ahead of us. I've organized this as a story that builds. Each chapter depends on what came before it. Each decision becomes comprehensible only when you understand the decisions that preceded it. I'd ask you not to skip ahead. The Battle of Leyte Gulf rewards patience. I want to say one more thing before we begin, and it's something I feel strongly enough about that I want to put it plainly rather than letting it remain implicit. This is a documentary about a battle, and battles involve the deaths of human beings. The 23rd through 26th of October, 1944, saw the deaths of somewhere above 10,000 Japanese sailors and approximately 3,000 American and Allied naval personnel. Those numbers are what the historical record supports. Though the uncertainty in the Japanese figure is significant because records were lost with the ships. Behind every one of those numbers is a specific person, a son, a father, a brother, a friend, who existed in a particular place and time, and was removed from it by the specific events we're about to discuss. I don't think military history serves anyone well when it loses sight of that. The formations and the maneuvers and the command decisions are the skeleton of the story. The men inside those formations are the story itself. I'll try to keep that balance throughout what follows. A brief word on how this documentary was built. Every date, name, ship designation, and operational detail in this narration is drawn from documented historical sources. Post-war interrogation records, official naval histories, memoir accounts, and the accumulated scholarship of 80 years of serious historical work on the battle, where the historical record is genuinely uncertain or disputed. And there are several significant points where it is, including the circumstances of Kurita's withdrawal and the precise sequence of events during the Surigao Strait night action. I've said so explicitly rather than papering over the uncertainty with false confidence. History done honestly has rough edges. This documentary has rough edges. That's not a flaw. It's the point, so. The 22nd of October 1944, the Japanese fleet is leaving Brunei. The American submarines are in position in the Palawan Passage. The destroyers and battleships of the 7th Fleet are anchored in Leyte Gulf. Supporting the soldiers, MacArthur has already put ashore, and somewhere to the north, in the Philippine Sea, Admiral Ozawa is preparing to sail his near-empty carriers south in the hope that someone will chase them. 4 converging forces, 1 sea, 4 days. Let's begin. If this kind of long-form, deeply researched military history is what you came here for, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Every documentary on this channel is built the same way. Primary sources, honest uncertainty where it exists, and the full story rather than the highlights reel. There are more battles, more campaigns, and more of the human texture of the Second World War ahead. I'd genuinely like to keep making them for you. Now, Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Road to Leyte. Why the Philippines mattered. I've always found it interesting that the Battle of Leyte Gulf almost didn't happen at all, at least not over the Philippines. There were serious, intelligent men in Washington and Pearl Harbor who thought the next major American objective after the Marianas should be Formosa, the island of Taiwan, as it's now known, and their logic was sound. Formosa sat at a choke point between Japan and its southern resource empire. The oil fields of Borneo, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice of Southeast Asia. Cut Formosa, and you strangled Japan's supply lines with a single, elegant surgical move. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, was a Formosa man. So, initially, was Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded all Pacific naval forces. But there was another voice in the room. General Douglas MacArthur had made a promise. In March of 1942, as Japanese forces closed in on the Philippines and he was ordered to evacuate, MacArthur told the Filipino people that he would return. Those 2 words, "I shall return," became something more than a military statement. They became a commitment that bound American honor to the liberation of a nation. MacArthur understood this, and he pressed it hard. The Philippines, he argued, wasn't just strategically sensible, it was morally obligatory. The historian Adrian Stewart has written that MacArthur argued passionately that he had given his and America's word that the islands should be liberated as soon as possible, making the invasion a matter of both national honor and obligation. That framing gave MacArthur's argument a weight that purely strategic calculations couldn't easily counter. What tipped the balance was a meeting in July of 1944 aboard a cruiser in Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt, MacArthur, and Nimitz were all present, and the debate over Formosa versus the Philippines was laid out plainly. Nimitz shifted. He came to agree that an invasion of Formosa would require roughly 12 Army and Marine divisions, far more than were available in the Pacific before Germany was defeated. MacArthur needed fewer forces. His plan was achievable with what was actually on hand. Practical arithmetic, in the end, supported the moral argument. The decision was made. The next objective would be the Philippines, starting with the island of Leyte in the central archipelago. Now, to understand why Leyte made military sense, you have to look at a map and think about Japanese logistics. Japan's entire war economy depended on a chain of supply running from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and Borneo northward through the Philippine Sea and back to the home islands. Tankers, freighters, troop transports. They all had to pass through or near the Philippines. If American forces could establish airfields on Leyte and then push northward to Luzon, that supply chain could be compressed and eventually severed entirely. MacArthur had grasped this years before the meeting at Pearl Harbor and his campaign through New Guinea, crawling along the northern coast of that enormous island through 1943 and 44, had been oriented toward this exact goal. Every beach landing, every airstrip captured was a step closer to the moment he could look back at the Philippines from close range. I want to pause here and note something that gets glossed over in most popular accounts. By the time MacArthur's forces landed on Leyte on the 20th of October 1944, the American position in the Pacific had already fundamentally shifted. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought 4 months earlier in June, had been a catastrophe for Japanese naval aviation. American carrier pilots, many of them far better trained and flying far better aircraft than their Japanese counterparts, had destroyed approximately 600 Japanese aircraft in the course of that battle. Carrier crews called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though that nickname understates the human cost on both sides. What matters for our story is that it left the Imperial Japanese Navy with little carrier-borne air power and very few experienced pilots. When Leyte Gulf arrived, the Japanese were trying to fight a carrier battle without fully functioning carriers. That context is everything. The American force that supported MacArthur's landing was enormous, arguably the largest naval armada ever assembled to that point in the Pacific. Reporting to MacArthur, Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet, which included more than 700 ships, among them 6 battleships, 11 cruisers, and 18 escort carriers, plus hundreds of amphibious and support vessels. The 7th Fleet's primary job was supporting the landings. It was built for shore bombardment, for putting soldiers on beaches, for supplying them once they were there. It wasn't designed to fight a fleet action on the open sea. That distinction matters enormously when we get to the 25th of October. Additionally, providing distant air cover was Admiral William Bull, Halsey's 3rd Fleet, which was built for exactly that kind of heavy combat. 17 aircraft carriers, 6 fast battleships, dozens of destroyers and cruiser escorts. Here is where a structural problem that haunts the entire battle begins to show itself. Kinkaid reported to MacArthur, whose command was rooted in the Army and Southwest Pacific. Halsey reported to Nimitz, whose domain was the Central Pacific. There was no single admiral with authority over both fleets. Historian after historian has returned to this fact. According to the United States Army's own official history, Halsey's orders said that if the opportunity to destroy the major portion of the Japanese fleet should arise or could be created, that destruction was to be his primary task. That one sentence, written into his orders before the battle began, would become the most consequential piece of paperwork in the entire engagement. It gave Halsey latitude. Too much of it, some would argue afterward. The Japanese, I should note, had their own command problems. Combined Fleet Chief Admiral Suemu Toyoda had prepared a series of contingency plans named Sho-Gō, roughly translated as Operation Victory. Sho-Gō 1 was the plan for the Philippines. Subsequent numbered versions covered Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Kuriles. Each plan was built around a desperate, concentrated offensive. Commit nearly everything that remained to a decisive engagement, force a crisis, and try to change the trajectory of a war that was already going badly. Toyoda understood the logic of attrition was working against Japan. He needed a single dramatic blow, not a slow grind. And so Sho-Gō 1 was, from its conception, an all-or-nothing gamble. Admiral Toyoda himself would later say, with striking candor, that should Japan lose the Philippines, even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off, so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese waters, could not obtain its fuel supply. There would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines. That quote is one of those moments when history becomes transparent. You see the machinery of decision-making laid bare. Toyoda wasn't ordering his fleet into battle because he thought he could win in any conventional sense. He was ordering them in because the alternative, doing nothing, was also a kind of defeat, just a slower one. There's something almost tragic in that reasoning, and I think it's important to sit with it for a moment before we move into the operational details. The men who sailed under Sho-Gō 1 didn't believe they were going to survive. Some of them said so explicitly. That knowledge, that the men planning the most complex naval operation in Japanese history were operating under something close to a death sentence, shapes how we should understand every decision they made in the days that followed. By the 17th of October, the Imperial Japanese Navy had spotted the Allied assault forces gathering near Leyte and activated Sho-Gō 1. The Japanese naval forces were organized into three groups that Western accounts would call the Northern Force, the Center Force, and the Southern Force. They sailed from different ports, some from Japan, some from Brunei, some from the Lingga Islands near Singapore, on the 22nd of October, converging on the Philippines from different directions like the arms of a closing trap. The plan was elegant on paper. Reality, as it always does, had other ideas. Chapter 2. The Plan. Operation Sho-Gō 1 and the Three Forces. Let me describe the shape of Operation Sho-Gō 1, because understanding it is the only way to understand why the next 4 days unfolded the way they did. It's the kind of plan that looks brilliant on a war room map and immediately reveals its complications the moment ships begin moving. I've spent a lot of time with this plan, the diagrams, the orders, the post-war testimonies of the officers who designed it, and I keep coming back to the same impression. It required too many things to go right simultaneously, in conditions that made simultaneous coordination nearly impossible. The centerpiece of the plan was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's force, referred to in Allied accounts as the Center Force, and in Japanese planning as the First Diversion Attack Force. This was, by any measure, a formidable fleet. Kurita sailed from Brunei with 5 battleships, the Yamato, the Musashi, the Nagato, the Kongo, and the Haruna, plus 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The Yamato and the Musashi were the largest battleships ever built. Each displaced more than 60,000 tons, fully loaded. Their main batteries, 9 guns each, fired shells that weighed roughly 1.5 tons. I mention those numbers not to glorify the machinery, but because they explain why Allied planners were so anxious about these ships. There was, in 1944, genuinely no equivalent in the American or British inventory. Kurita's mission was to pass through the Philippine archipelago from the west, entering through the Palawan Passage, crossing the Sibuyan Sea, threading through the San Bernardino Strait between Luzon and Samar, and then turn south to fall on the American amphibious shipping in Leyte Gulf from the north. The route was long, complicated by geography, and required transiting waters where American air power could find and strike him. He knew this. His staff knew this. The plan provided no air cover for the center force during its passage through the Sibuyan Sea. None. The land-based aircraft that were supposed to neutralize American carrier aviation before Kurita's fleet reached the critical strait were already badly depleted from the fighting over Formosa. Kurita was essentially being asked to run a gauntlet. Simultaneously, a force known to Western historians as the Southern Force would approach Leyte Gulf from a different direction. Through the Surigao Strait, which forms the southern entrance to the Gulf. This southern force was itself divided into two groups. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded the lead element, which included the old battleships Yamashishiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. Roughly 40 miles behind him, Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima commanded a second group comprising 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers. The timing between Nishimura and Shima was never properly coordinated, partly because strict radio silence was imposed on both forces during their approach. They couldn't talk to each other. This wasn't an oversight exactly. Radio communications could betray position, but it meant that 2 components of the same pincer were operating essentially blind to one another. Then there was the third force, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force. And this is the piece of the plan that is most remarkable in its cold-blooded logic. Ozawa's force was built around 4 aircraft carriers, the Zuikaku, the Zuiho, the Chitose, and the Chiyoda. But here is the thing that I find myself dwelling on every time I read the accounts. There were almost no aircraft on those carriers. After the losses of the Philippine Sea, after months of attrition that had gutted not just planes, but the experienced pilots needed to fly them, Ozawa's carrier force was essentially a hollow shell. His entire mission was to be seen, to present the appearance of a major carrier strike force, to send what few aircraft he had on one-way flights toward American ships in order to attract attention, and then to maneuver in a way that would draw Halsey's Third Fleet northward and away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa himself fully expected his force to be destroyed. He accepted this. He considered it a form of service. I find that particular piece of history genuinely difficult to categorize in the usual terms of military analysis. Ozawa was sailing with carriers that couldn't fight, counting on his own destruction to open a gap that Kurita could exploit. It's worth stating plainly, separate from any ideology, the man knew he was leading a sacrifice operation. He'd made his peace with it. His post-war accounts are notable for their lack of bitterness about this role. What drove him was the belief that if Kurita could reach the Leyte anchorage and destroy the amphibious shipping, the invasion could be stopped. And if the invasion was stopped, perhaps a negotiated peace from a position of less desperate weakness was still possible. That was the calculation. It wasn't correct, as events would show, but it wasn't irrational. The coordination problem embedded in Sho-Gō 1 is worth examining in some detail. The 3 forces were sailing from different locations on different timetables and were expected to converge on Leyte Gulf within roughly the same window of time on the 25th of October. Kurita needed to pass through the San Bernardino Strait during the night of the 24th to 25th in order to arrive at the Gulf at roughly the same time Nishimura entered from the south. But Kurita's passage depended on surviving air attacks through the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th, and the severity of those attacks was unknown. Nishimura's timing through the Surigao Strait was similarly contingent on factors that couldn't be controlled from a planning table in Tokyo, and Ozawa's ability to attract Halsey depended on Halsey deciding to take the bait. Each link in the chain was a conditional. There's a concept in military planning, sometimes described as the friction of war, The idea that real operations inevitably diverge from planned operations, and that the accumulating weight of small failures, delays, misunderstandings, and bad luck can transform even a sensible plan into chaos. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is, among other things, a case study in friction. Nearly everything that could go wrong in the execution of Sho-Gō did go wrong, and yet the plan came closer to succeeding than most people realize. Closer than the American commanders at the time were entirely comfortable admitting afterward. One more element of the strategic picture deserves attention before we move to the opening moves of the battle. Halsey's orders, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, gave him explicit permission to pursue and destroy the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arose. But the ambiguity in those orders cut both ways. They also meant that there was no predetermined boundary between Halsey's responsibilities to the invasion force and his freedom to chase carriers. When the battle developed, this ambiguity would become a fault line running through the entire American command structure. Kincaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, believed he had an understanding with Halsey about how the San Bernardino Strait would be covered. Halsey operated under no such understanding. Both men were behaving rationally within their respective command frameworks. They just weren't in the same command framework. By the morning of the 22nd of October, the Japanese fleets were moving. Kurita's center force and Nishimura's southern force had departed from Brunei on the same day, heading in different directions through the Sulu Sea. Ozawa was steaming south from Japanese home waters. The geography of the Philippines was about to become the stage for the most complex and consequential naval engagement of the Second World War, and in the waters of the Palawan Passage, running submerged and silent, 2 American submarines were picking up signals on their radar screens that neither crew had been expecting. Chapter 3, Palawan Passage, the Submarine Strike. The 23rd of October, 1944. Midnight has just passed, and the Palawan Passage is black. This is the narrow body of water running along the western coast of the Philippine island of Palawan. A channel roughly 40 kilometers wide, at its narrowest, flanked by reefs and shoals that make navigation in the dark genuinely dangerous. Kurita's center force is transiting this passage in a long column. The great grey shapes of the Yamato and the Musashi near the center of the formation, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers. It's a powerful fleet. It's also, as of midnight, already being watched. 2 American submarines, the USS Data and the USS Dace, had been operating together in the Palawan area, positioned there as part of a broader submarine patrol line that American planners had established in anticipation of exactly this kind of Japanese fleet movement. At 1:16 in the early morning of the 23rd, Data's radar picked up a large contact at a range of roughly 30,000 yards, nearly 17 miles, in the Palawan Passage. Her commanding officer identified the formation as Japanese warships and immediately began sending contact reports. At least one of those reports was intercepted by radio operators aboard the Yamato, but Kurita failed to take appropriate anti-submarine precautions. That failure, that small, seemingly inconsequential command decision, not to zigzag, not to deploy destroyer screens more aggressively, would cost him 2 heavy cruisers within a few hours. The Data and the Dace ran on the surface through the rest of the night, pushing their diesel engines hard to get ahead of the Japanese formation. Submarine commanders called this gaining an attack position, and it required careful calculation of the enemy's speed and course, combined with your own maximum surface speed. Both submarines managed to get ahead of Kurita's column by first light. Then they submerged and waited. The attack, when it came, was unusually successful by the standards of submarine warfare, a field in which even well-aimed torpedo salvos often missed or failed to detonate due to the notoriously unreliable American Mark 14 torpedo, which had plagued the submarine force throughout much of the war. By the autumn of 1944, however, those torpedo problems had largely been resolved. At 5:24 in the morning, Data fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Otago, Kurita's own flagship. At least 4 of them connected. The Otago sank so quickly that Kurita was forced to abandon ship and swim for his life in the Palawan Passage. In the dark, with the sounds of a sinking warship around him, he was eventually picked up by the Japanese destroyer Kishinami and transferred to the battleship Yamato, which then became his new flagship. 10 minutes after the first spread hit the Otago, Data used her stern tubes to put 2 more torpedoes into the Otago's sister ship, the heavy cruiser Takao, crippling her. Then the Dace, positioned slightly apart, fired 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Maya, which went down quickly with significant loss of life. 2 heavy cruisers destroyed, 1 badly damaged and forced to turn back, all before breakfast. I want to stay with Kurita for a moment, because the psychological dimension of this opening is often underrated. The man lost his flagship to submarine attack within the first hours of the operation. He had to swim for his life. He then transferred to a new flagship and continued the mission. We don't have a detailed account of his inner state during those hours. The memoirs and post-war interrogations are thin on personal reflection. But it's reasonable to assume that whatever composure he projected, the morning of the 23rd was not a good one. He was also, I should note, 61 years old. That's not old for a contemporary reader, but for a man who had been in continuous operational service for decades and was now commanding the most critical naval mission of the Pacific War. Swimming through the dark waters of the Palawan Passage at dawn was not a beginning that augured well. The Takao, too badly damaged to continue, turned back toward Brunei with 2 destroyers as escort. The Data followed, hoping to finish her off with further attacks. And here the submarine story takes an unexpected turn. On the 24th, while still shadowing the retreating Takao, the Data ran aground on the Bombay Shoal at speed. She hit fast and hard, and all efforts to work her off the reef failed. The entire crew had to be taken off by the Dace, which then tried repeatedly to scuttle the stranded submarine to prevent her equipment from falling into Japanese hands. Torpedoes were fired at Data by her own partnership. They hit the reef instead of the hull. Gunfire from the Dace, and later the USS Nautilus, did superficial damage. The Data sat there, stubbornly on the shoal, partially wrecked, but intact enough to frustrate every destruction effort, until American commanders finally concluded that the Japanese weren't going to bother with the wreck and left it there. Meanwhile, the contact reports from Data and Dace had reached American fleet commanders, and the picture was becoming clearer. Kurita's powerful center force was moving through the Palawan Passage, heading east toward the Philippine archipelago. The clock on the battle's next phase had started. Halsey was alerted. Carrier aircraft began preparing strikes, and Kurita, aboard the Yamato, pressed on. He had lost 2 cruisers and his flagship before the battle had even formally begun. He didn't turn back. He didn't request permission to abort. He continued east toward the Sibuyan Sea, into the teeth of what was going to be one of the heaviest air attacks any surface fleet had endured in the Pacific War. There's a detail from the account of the Palawan Passage that I keep returning to. Kurita's force had been detected on radar at 17 miles distance in the dark. The Americans had submarines precisely placed along the most logical route for a Japanese fleet sortie. The contact reports were sent in time to alert the carrier groups. Every element of the American early warning system worked exactly as designed. And yet, 4 days later, Kurita's fleet would still nearly reach the Leyte anchorage. The submarine attack in the Palawan Passage was a significant American success. It opened the battle with 2 Japanese cruisers destroyed and a 3rd crippled. But it didn't stop Kurita. Nothing short of sinking the Yamato was going to stop Kurita at that stage. Understanding that persistence, that dogged, almost irrational forward momentum, is essential to understanding everything that followed. The Dace made it safely back to port after rescuing the Darter's crew. The story of those two submarines, one grounded on a reef, her crew transferred under fire, the other exhausted and carrying twice her normal complement, is a smaller, quieter story within the larger battle, but it's worth holding in your mind as we move forward. Because the entire Battle of Leyte Gulf is made of smaller stories like that. Men making decisions in tight spaces, under pressure, with incomplete information, trying to do the right thing. Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they didn't. That's the human texture of the battle, and it's what no organizational chart or fleet disposition map can fully capture. Chapter 4. The Sibuyan Sea. Fire from above the 24th of October, 1944. Kurita's center force has entered the Sibuyan Sea, the body of water at the heart of the Philippine archipelago, roughly enclosed by Luzon to the north, Mindoro to the west, and the Visayan Islands to the south and east. It's a broad, relatively deep stretch of open water, and in 1944 there was almost nowhere for a fleet to hide on it. American carrier aircraft could find you from 200 miles away. The Sibuyan Sea was, for Kurita's fleet, the most dangerous stretch of the journey, the long exposure before the San Bernardino Strait. He had no air cover. He had radar and anti-aircraft guns. That was it. The American carriers that would strike Kurita on the 24th were part of Task Force 38, the fast carrier task force that formed the cutting edge of Halsey's Third Fleet. Due to operational movements that had been planned before Darter's contact report came in, Halsey had detached 2 of his 4 carrier groups to the fleet base at Ulithi for replenishment. He recalled one of them, Rear Admiral Ralph Davison's group, when the contact reports started arriving, but he allowed the other, Vice Admiral John McCain's group, described in accounts as the strongest of the 4 carrier groups, to continue toward Ulithi. Halsey finally recalled McCain on the 24th. But by then, the delay meant the most powerful American carrier group would play almost no role in the air attacks on Kurita. Effectively, Third Fleet was operating at roughly 60% of its air strength for the critical phase of the battle. 3 carrier groups were available to strike that morning, the one best positioned to hit Kurita. Rear Admiral Gerald Bogan's Task Group 38.2 was, by unfortunate coincidence, the weakest of the 3 available groups. It contained only one large fleet carrier, the USS Intrepid, supported by 2 light carriers. The mathematics of the air campaign were already being constrained by the accidents of logistics and timing, before a single bomb was dropped. While this was developing, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet based on Luzon, directed 3 waves of land-based aircraft against the American carrier groups, each wave consisting of roughly 50 to 60 aircraft. This put Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman's carrier group, Task Group 38.3, under sustained air attack at the same time its aircraft were supposed to be striking Kurita. Most of the attacking Japanese planes were intercepted and shot down or turned back by American Hellcat fighters flying combat air patrol. One pilot in particular, Commander David McCampbell of the USS Essex, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, which remains a record for a single American air combat sortie in the Second World War. Running nearly out of fuel after the action, McCampbell had to land on the USS Langley because his own ship's deck was too busy to accommodate him at that moment. That's the kind of detail that makes the battle real to me. A man who had just done something almost superhuman, now circling above the deck, waiting for a parking space. One Japanese aircraft slipped through. A single Yokosuka D-4Y carrier bomber, the type that Allied pilots called Judy broke through Sherman's combat air patrol and hit the light carrier USS Princeton at 9:38 in the morning with a 550-pound armor-piercing bomb. Under most circumstances, a single bomb hit on a carrier is serious but survivable. What made the Princeton's situation different was the geometry of the hit. The bomb penetrated through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar bay, where 6 fully fueled and fully armed Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers were waiting for the next mission. The resulting explosions set off a cascade of secondary fires and detonations that the Princeton's damage control teams and emergency sprinkler systems couldn't contain. What followed over the next several hours was one of those slow disasters that naval history records with particular grimness. Ships came alongside to assist, destroyers, and then the light cruiser USS Birmingham. The fires kept burning. At 3:23 in the afternoon, there was an enormous explosion in the Princeton's bomb stowage aft. The cruiser Birmingham was alongside. At that moment, her decks crowded with firefighting crews and damage control parties. The blast killed 241 men aboard Birmingham and wounded 412 more. The Princeton's own dead numbered 108. Over 1,360 survivors were eventually rescued from the water by nearby ships. The Princeton, the largest American vessel lost during the entire Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the only Independence-class fast carrier sunk in combat during the war, was finally scuttled by torpedoes from the cruiser USS Reno at 5:50 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the air attacks on Kurita's center force had been going on for most of the day. Wave after wave of American carrier aircraft, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes, Hellcat fighters, hit the Japanese fleet across multiple strikes. The attacks were heavy. They were sustained. But they were not, in the end, sufficient to neutralize Kurita's entire force. What the American aircraft did manage was to concentrate an extraordinary weight of attack on a single target. The battleship Musashi. She was the largest Japanese battleship in Kurita's group that day, and she attracted attention the way the largest target always does. Over the course of the day's strikes, the Musashi absorbed at least 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo hits, numbers that seem almost impossible for a single ship to absorb. Yet it took all of them to sink her. She finally capsized and sank at approximately 7:35 in the evening, taking the majority of her crew with her. I want to be precise about what that means in terms of the overall air campaign. 5 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier flew 215 sorties against the center force on the 24th. All of that effort, concentrated over many hours, sank 1 battleship and crippled 1 cruiser. Every other ship in Kurita's force remained battle-worthy. The Yamato was hit. The Nagato was hit. They kept going. This is the operational reality of attacking well-constructed capital ships with aircraft in 1944. It was possible, but it required numbers and persistence that the available American carrier groups simply couldn't maintain after a single day's effort. Kurita eventually reversed course, turned his fleet west, away from the strikes, which gave American pilots the impression that he was retreating. That impression was critically important to what happened next. Halsey's staff interpreted the withdrawal as evidence that Kurita's force had been neutralized, damaged beyond the ability to pose a serious threat. Halsey himself sent a message indicating that the center force had been heavily damaged, according to strike reports, and that he was proceeding north to attack carrier forces at dawn. He was referring to Ozawa's decoy carriers, which American reconnaissance planes had finally located late that afternoon. The trap was beginning to close, not on the Japanese, but on the Americans. Kurita waited. At 5:15 in the afternoon, after his ships had cleared the worst of the air attacks and darkness was approaching, he reversed course again and headed east, back toward the San Bernardino Strait, back toward Leyte. He had lost the Musashi and had ships damaged. He had also essentially survived. And the strait ahead of him, as the night of the 24th drew on, was going to be completely unguarded. Chapter 5. Surigao Strait. The last battleship battle in history. While all of this was happening in the Cebian Sea on the 24th, a separate Japanese force was approaching Leyte Gulf from the south. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's element of the Southern Force. The battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, had been moving steadily through the Sulu Sea and into the Mindanao Sea since departing Brunei on the 22nd of October. His route led through the Surigao Strait, the narrow waterway between the islands of Leyte and Mindanao that forms the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf. The plan was to arrive at the Gulf in coordination with Kurita's center force attacking from the north. 2 jaws of the same trap. The coordination, as we've seen, was already fraying. Nishimura's force had to maintain radio silence for most of the approach. He couldn't know how Kurita was faring. He pressed on regardless. The American commander waiting for him at the top of the Surigao Strait was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, and Oldendorf had arranged what many historians consider to be one of the most perfectly constructed defensive ambushes in naval history. Oldendorf had at his disposal 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers, plus 39 motor torpedo boats. 5 of the 6 battleships had been sunk or damaged in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier, and subsequently repaired or, in the cases of the California and the West Virginia, essentially rebuilt from the keel up. The Mississippi had been in Icelandic waters on convoy escort duty when Pearl Harbor occurred and had not been damaged. These were the old battleships, slow, not built for fleet actions against modern Japanese surface ships. But in the Surigao Strait, geometry was going to matter more than speed. Oldendorf placed his 6 battleships in a line across the northern end of the strait, the top of a capital letter T, with Nishimura's force forming the bottom stroke as it advanced north up the waterway. This formation, known as crossing the T, is one of the oldest and most sought-after positions in naval gunnery. Every ship in the line across the top can bring all its guns to bear on the ships in the column below. The ships in the column can only fire their forward batteries. The rear of the column is masked by the ships ahead of it. It's a position of enormous tactical advantage, and it was becoming rarer as naval warfare moved increasingly toward aircraft and submarines. Oldendorf's crossing of the T at Surigao Strait was the last time in history that naval forces achieved this classic maneuver in combat. Before the battleships and cruisers even came into play, Nishimura had to run a gauntlet of torpedo boats and destroyers arranged down both sides of the strait. At 22:36, on the night of the 24th, a PT boat made the first contact with the approaching Japanese column. The motor torpedo boats made repeated attacks over more than 3.5 hours, advancing in the dark against the Japanese destroyers that screened Nishimura's battleships. No torpedo hits were scored by the PT boats. The attacks were repelled, but their contact reports were valuable, tracking Nishimura's position and course with enough accuracy for Oldendorf to time his own moves precisely. Then the destroyers struck. Deployed on both sides of the strait, American destroyer divisions made torpedo attacks that tore into the Southern force with devastating results. At around 3 in the morning, both Japanese battleships were hit. The Fuso, struck by torpedoes from the USS Melvin, fell out of formation and eventually capsized. There is a famous and dramatic account, repeated in many popular histories, that the Fuso was cut in 2 by an explosion and floated in 2 halves for some time, creating an eerie spectacle for watching sailors. A survivor from the Fuso, interrogated after the war, gave an account that didn't mention the bisection, describing instead a slow capsize to starboard. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official American naval historian, recorded the two halves version. The historical record on this specific point isn't fully resolved. I mention this not to be pedantic, but because it's exactly the kind of detail where honest historical writing has to acknowledge ambiguity. Two of Nishimura's 4 destroyers were also sunk in the destroyer attacks. A third was hit and forced to retire. Yamashiro pressed on with the Mogami and one remaining destroyer, Sho-Gō, into the killing zone where Oldendorf's battleships were waiting. At 3:16 in the morning, the West Virginia's radar picked up the surviving ships at a range of roughly 42,000 yards. She waited. At 3:53, from a range of about 22,000 yards, the West Virginia fired the 8 16-inch guns of her main battery at the Yamashiro, which she struck with her first salvo. The California and the Tennessee joined in minutes later. The other 3 battleships, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, had less advanced gunnery radar and had more difficulty finding targets. The Pennsylvania couldn't find a target at all, and her guns stayed silent. The Maryland eventually managed to range in by watching the splashes of the other ship's shells and fired 48 16-inch shells. The Mississippi fired just once, a single full main battery salvo of 12 14-inch shells. That salvo from the Mississippi, a single firing, 1 broadside, 12 shells falling into the dark waters of the Surigao Strait, was the last time in history that a battleship fired on another battleship in combat. Not just the last time in the Pacific War, the last time in any war. A chapter in naval history that stretched back centuries, back to the age of wooden ships of the line, back to the tactical maneuvers of Nelson at Trafalgar, ended that morning in the Surigao Strait, in the dark, with a single salvo from an aging American battleship. I find that worth sitting with. Not sentimentally, exactly. The men on the receiving end of those shells weren't experiencing history in any elevated sense. But from this distance, it's one of those moments where the weight of what was happening becomes visible. The Yamashiro was struck by a torpedo from the destroyer USS Benion and sank at approximately 4:20 in the morning of the 25th of October. Vice Admiral Nishimura went down with his flagship. The Mogami and the Sho-Gō turned south and tried to escape down the strait. Behind them, roughly 40 miles back, Vice Admiral Shima's second striking force was just arriving. Shima had received almost no reliable information about what had happened to Nishimura. The radio silence and the chaos of the battle meant he was navigating by inference. He saw burning wreckage in the strait, mistook it for the remains of both of Nishimura's battleships, and concluded that the entire lead element had been destroyed. His flagship Nachi collided with the retreating Mogami in the dark, flooding the Mogami's steering room. Shima, correctly assessing that continuing north against Oldendorf's undamaged line would accomplish nothing except the loss of his own ships, ordered a retreat. The Mogami, her steering compromised by the collision, fell behind during the retreat and was caught by American carrier aircraft the following morning. She was abandoned and finished off by a Japanese torpedo from the Akabono rather than be captured. The light cruiser Abukuma, which had been hit by a torpedo from a PT boat during the night approach, also couldn't keep up and was later sunk by Army Air Force's bombers. Of Nishimura's original 7 ships, only the destroyer Sho-Gō escaped the Surigao Strait, and she would be lost to an American submarine in January of 1945, off the coast of Malaya. Shima's force survived the strait action, though several of his ships were lost in subsequent engagements around Leyte. The southern force was finished as a threat to the invasion. There's a dimension of the Surigao Strait battle that I haven't mentioned yet, and I want to address it because it affected the next day's events in ways that are easy to overlook. After the night action ended and Shima's force retreated, Oldendorf's battleships turned south to pursue. They didn't press the pursuit far. Oldendorf was concerned about fuel and ammunition. His cruisers had fired enormous quantities of shells. Some ships were already running low on certain calibers. He pulled the pursuit back and reorganized his force. This decision was tactically reasonable, but it meant that Oldendorf's heavy ships were positioned at the southern end of Leyte Gulf, pointing south, at the moment when the real crisis of the 25th was developing to the north and east, off the coast of Samar. Chapter 6. Halsey Goes North. The decision that changed everything. I want to go back to the afternoon of the 24th of October. Because everything that happens on the morning of the 25th depends on a decision made at Halsey's headquarters aboard the battleship USS New Jersey, sometime around 8 o'clock in the evening. This is the decision that has generated more historical controversy than any other single command choice in the Pacific War. Not because it was obviously wrong at the time. It wasn't necessarily given what Halsey knew, but because of what it left uncovered when it turned out to be wrong. By late afternoon on the 24th, Halsey had a partial picture of the battle developing around him. His aircraft had struck Kurita's center force repeatedly through the Sibuyan Sea and had watched the fleet turn west, apparently retreating. His southern flank was, as far as he knew, being handled by Oldendorf's battleships and destroyers waiting in the Surigao Strait. And then, at 4:40 in the afternoon, American reconnaissance aircraft finally located Ozawa's northern force, 4 aircraft carriers, screened by battleships and cruisers and destroyers, roughly 200 miles to the north. Here was the dilemma. For the previous weeks, the one piece of the Japanese fleet that had eluded American strike aircraft was Japanese carrier aviation. Carrier forces had been the dominant weapon system of the Pacific War since Pearl Harbor. American carrier commanders were acutely aware of the threat that Japanese flat-tops posed. The irony, which we can see clearly from this distance, but which Halsey could not, was that Ozawa's carriers were by this point largely empty. There were only 108 aircraft distributed among the 4 ships. They had launched a strike against Third Fleet earlier in the day. Most of those aircraft flew on to Philippine airfields rather than returning to the carriers, because there weren't enough deck crews and fuel to recover them. Ozawa had been trying, quite deliberately, to make his force appear threatening. He even broke radio silence in violation of normal operational security, hoping to attract American attention. For most of the day, it hadn't worked. Third Fleet was too busy with Kurita. Then at 4:40, the scouts found him. Halsey made his assessment. Kurita appeared to be retreating. Nishimura was being handled in the south. Ozawa's carriers were to the north, unengaged and constituted. In Halsey's judgment, the main remaining Japanese threat, he decided to take his entire available force north, all 3 available carrier groups and all of Willis Lee's fast battleships. Not a detachment, not a covering force left at San Bernardino Strait. Everything. I want to be careful here not to simply prosecute Halsey with the benefit of hindsight. Several historians, Samuel Eliot Morison, Thomas Cutler, and others, have noted that his decision was a reasonable one given incomplete information. He didn't know that Kurita had already reversed course at 5:15 in the afternoon and was heading back towards San Bernardino. He didn't know that Ozawa's carriers were nearly empty. He believed his carriers had done sufficient damage to the center force to neutralize it as a threat. His orders explicitly prioritized the destruction of the Japanese fleet when the opportunity arose. And Ozawa's carriers, to anyone who had fought Japanese naval aviation at Coral Sea Midway or the Philippine Sea, looked very much like an opportunity. But there were warning signs that Halsey ignored, or that his staff blocked from reaching him. a night reconnaissance aircraft launched from the light carrier Independence. Operating precisely because she was configured for night operations, spotted Kurita's center force turning back east through the San Bernardino Strait. The navigation lights in the strait itself had been turned on. Rear Admiral Gerald Bogan, commanding Task Group 38.2, radioed this information to Halsey's flagship and was brushed off by a staff officer who told him tersely, Yes, we have that information. Vice Admiral Willis Lee, who commanded the battleships and who had concluded, correctly, that Ozawa's carrier force was a deliberate decoy, sent a blinker signal to Halsey's flagship expressing his concerns. He was similarly dismissed. Two other officers, Commodore Arleigh Burke and Commander James Flatley, serving on Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's staff, had also worked out that Ozawa was a decoy. They were worried enough to wake Mitcher in the middle of the night. Mitcher asked whether Halsey had the report. On being told he did, Mitcher, reportedly knowing Halsey's temperament, said, "If he wants my advice, he'll ask for it," and went back to sleep. I find that exchange extraordinary. Senior officers up and down the chain of command had, independently, worked out that something was wrong. And the institutional culture of Third Fleet in the autumn of 1944, perhaps the general atmosphere of confidence that came from many months of operational success, meant that none of them pushed hard enough. Mitcher's comment about Halsey's temperament is a window into the human dynamics of command. Even correct judgment can be silenced by awareness of a superior's personality. At the same time, back in the 7th Fleet, Admiral Kinkaid was operating on an assumption that turned out to be false. Earlier that afternoon, Halsey had sent a message describing a contingency plan for a force of fast battleships designated Task Force 30 FAR, which would be formed to guard the San Bernardino Strait. The message was poorly worded. Halsey intended it as a conditional plan for future consideration, but he wrote will be formed rather than may be formed, and the distinction is doing a great deal of work. Kinkaid, reading the message, concluded that Task Force 30 FAR had already been established and was guarding the strait. Nimitz at Pearl Harbor reached the same conclusion. When Halsey sent a clarifying message later in the day, specifying that Task Force 30 FAR would only be formed when he ordered it, he sent it by short-range voice radio, a format that Kinkaid's ships, well to the south, couldn't receive. He didn't follow up with a telegraph message to either Kinkaid or Nimitz. The gap between what Halsey meant, what he wrote, and what his subordinates understood grew silently wider through the night. Third Fleet steamed north. Everything available, carriers, fast battleships, every destroyer that wasn't needed for immediate escort duties. As the historian C. Van Woodward later wrote, everything was pulled out from San Bernardino Strait. Not so much as a picket destroyer was left. The San Bernardino Strait, the narrow passage between the islands of Luzon and Samar, through which Kurita's center force was now approaching from the west, was completely unguarded. Standing in the dark waters on the other side of that passage, to the south and east, off the coast of Samar, were 3 task units of 7th Fleet escort carriers. They were designated by their radio call signs, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Their ships were slow, lightly armored, and designed to support amphibious operations, to bomb beaches, hunt submarines, and provide air cover for soldiers getting off landing craft. They were not, in any military sense, equipped to fight a surface action against a fleet that included the Yamato and the Nagato. The men aboard those escort carriers did not know that Kurita was coming. They had no reason to expect him. Their night of the 24th passed quietly. The Battle of Surigao Strait was being fought to their south, which they knew about. To the north, Halsey's 3rd Fleet was racing toward Ozawa's decoy carriers. In the strait to their northwest, Kurita's center force, 17 large warships, including the largest battleship in the world, emerged into the Philippine Sea at 3 in the morning of the 25th of October and turned south. The crews of Taffy 3 were eating breakfast when the lookouts reported large caliber gunfire splashes in the water around them, splashes of a color and size that only the main batteries of battleships produced. At first, and I think this is worth dwelling on, some of them assumed it was Halsey's fast battleships, conducting a friendly fire exercise at an awkward distance. It took a few minutes for the recognition to form that this wasn't friendly fire, that those were Japanese ships, that those were Japanese battleships, that there was no one between them and the Leyte anchorage. What happened next? The Battle off Samar is one of the most remarkable actions of the Second World War, but it is properly the story of the next chapter. I want to close this one by sitting with the strategic situation as it existed at dawn on the 25th of October, 1944. Halsey's carriers were racing north toward Ozawa's hollow decoy force. Oldendorf's battleships were reorganizing to the south, their ammunition partially depleted, their fuel low, pointing in the wrong direction. Kincaid was just beginning to understand that the thing he'd assumed to be true, that someone was guarding San Bernardino Strait, was not true. And Kurita's center force was in the open water off Samar, moving fast and shooting. Every mistake made in the preceding 24 hours. The ambiguous message about Task Force 30 Halsey's dismissal of Bogan's warning, the absence of a supreme commander with authority over both fleets, was about to converge on 3 task units of escort carriers, with a combined total of roughly 400 aircraft and no armor. This is the point in any honest account of Leyte Gulf, where the analysis has to pause and acknowledge something. The United States had more ships, more aircraft, more industrial capacity, and more operational flexibility than the Japanese at this stage of the war. The battle was, in broad terms, winnable for the Americans under almost any reasonably competent set of command decisions. But the specific events of the morning of the 25th came uncomfortably close to being catastrophic. The men who prevented that catastrophe, the destroyer captains and escort carrier pilots of Taffy 3, did so without any of the structural advantages that the American command system had theoretically provided. They did it on their own, with what they had, against everything Kurita could bring to bear. That story deserves a chapter to itself. Chapter 7, Taffy 3, The Destroyer's Charge. There's a moment in the early morning of the 25th of October, 1944, that I keep coming back to. A moment that, when I first read about it in a detailed account of the battle, made me stop and put the book down for a while. At approximately 6:45 in the morning, the men aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, a ship the size of a converted cargo vessel, capable of about 18 knots, armed with a single 5-inch gun on her stern, looked to the northwest and saw, emerging from a rain squall, the pagoda masts of Japanese battleships. The silhouettes were unmistakable to anyone who had studied the recognition charts. That tower superstructure, stacked and tapering like something from an older century of naval architecture. The Yamato, the Nagato, heavy cruisers beyond them, all of them steaming south at high speed, their bows pushing white water, their guns already beginning to track. Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague commanded Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, in the radio shorthand of the battle. He had 6 escort carriers, the Fanshawe Bay, the Saint, Lo, the White Plains, the Kalinin Bay, the Kitkun Bay, and the Gambier Bay. Escorting them were 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hole, and the Heerman, and 4 destroyer escorts, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the John C. Butler, and the Raymond. The distinction between a destroyer and a destroyer escort matters here. A destroyer escort was smaller, slower, and less heavily armed than a full-size destroyer. The Samuel B. Roberts, for instance, carried 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. She displaced about 1,300 tons fully loaded. She was being asked, within minutes, to act as a shield against ships that displaced 10 times her weight and fired shells that could punch through her hull without detonating, simply because their fuses were set for armored targets rather than thin-skinned escort vessels. That mechanical accident, Japanese gunners using armor-piercing shells configured for fleet combat, not the light ships they were actually hitting, probably saved Taffy 3 from complete annihilation in the first hour of the engagement. Sprague's immediate response was textbook emergency procedure, executed with unusual speed and decisiveness. He turned his carriers into the wind, southeast to launch aircraft, ordering every plane airborne regardless of armament or fuel load. He ordered a smoke screen laid down. He sent a contact report to Kinkaid in plain, uncoded language, under attack by a force including 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and numerous destroyers. His message to Halsey, relayed through Kinkaid. Where is Task Force 30 far? The world wonders. Actually, that last phrase wasn't Sprague's. It appeared in a different famous message later in the day. But the urgency was exactly that raw. What Sprague communicated to anyone reading his plain language transmissions was the unadorned truth of his situation. He was in deep trouble, and he needed help immediately. The help available to him in the immediate term was essentially his 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Sprague ordered them to lay smoke and attack. This was an order that, read plainly, asked these small ships to close with a Japanese surface force that included the Yamato, and to do so at high speed in daylight, in open water, with weapons that would at best damage, and at worst, merely inconvenience their targets. The commanding officer of the Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee citizen from Oklahoma, who had reportedly told his crew at the beginning of his command that this was a fighting ship and he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who didn't want to go with him could transfer off, turned his destroyer toward the Japanese fleet and increased to flank speed before he even received Sprague's formal order. He went without being told. He went because that was what the situation required, and he understood it before the order was written. The Johnston, making 30 knots and laying smoke, closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese formation and fired her 10 torpedo tubes, a full spread, at the heavy cruiser Kumano. At least 1 or 2 of the torpedoes connected, blowing Kumano's bow off. She slowed and dropped out of formation. Then the Johnston turned away, laying more smoke, and took 3 14-inch shells and 3 6-inch shells in quick succession from Japanese battleships and cruisers. The hits destroyed her bridge, knocked out her aft engine room, wrecked her steering, and killed or wounded a significant portion of her crew, including Commander Evans, who lost 2 fingers to shrapnel. Evans moved to the exposed aft conning position. All the other stations were wrecked, and continued to fight his ship. The Johnston was hit repeatedly throughout the next 2 hours, and continued fighting. She was hit approximately 45 times before she finally sank at around 10 in the morning. The Hull came next, making her torpedo run against the Kongo and the Haguro, firing all 10 of her tubes in 2 separate attacks. The second attack brought her to within 9,000 yards of the Japanese battleship line. She was struck by more than 40 large caliber shells during the engagement, and sank at approximately 8:40 in the morning, with the loss of 253 of her 310 crew members. The Heermann, the 3rd destroyer, made 3 separate torpedo attacks, firing at the Haguro, the Chikuma, and finally at the Yamato herself at close range. The Yamato, rather than accepting torpedo attack from the port side, turned north to comb the tracks, to present her bow to the incoming weapons and reduce her silhouette. That turn north took the Yamato out of the battle for nearly 10 minutes. The largest battleship in the world, carrying 9 18.1-inch guns, was temporarily removed from the action by a single destroyer, firing torpedoes in a desperate attack. The Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that her crew members account later compared to a destroyer escort going against a cruiser with a penknife, fired her 3 torpedoes at the Chokai, scoring what appeared to have been at least 1 hit. She then closed to gun range and fought the Japanese cruisers for over an hour with her 5-inch guns, firing at a rate that wore out the guns themselves. She was hit heavily and repeatedly, eventually taking a salvo of 8-inch shells that opened up enormous holes in her hull. She sank at approximately 9:05 in the morning. Her executive officer later wrote an account of her final minutes that is one of the most harrowing primary source descriptions in the Pacific War's literature. Of the 224 men in her crew, 89 were killed or died of injuries. Of the survivors who went into the water, many remained there for nearly 50 hours before rescue arrived. What the destroyers and destroyer escorts accomplished during those hours was not, in a strictly military sense, sufficient to stop Kurita. His fleet was still powerful. His guns were still firing. But the attacks did 2 things that mattered enormously. First, they disrupted the Japanese formation. The coordinated cruiser columns that were supposed to close around the carriers were broken up by repeated torpedo threats, forcing individual ships to take evasive action and lose their positioning. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they consumed time. Every minute that Kurita's fleet spent managing the destroyer attacks was a minute that Sprague's escort carriers were putting more distance between themselves and the Japanese guns. The weather helped. A rain squall gave the carriers brief cover several times during the chase. The aircraft helped too, making increasingly improvised attacks with whatever ordnance they had, and eventually making dry runs. Attacking with no weapons at all, simply diving on Japanese ships to force them to maneuver. The whole engagement had the quality of something improvised under extreme pressure, and somehow, improbably, working. What it couldn't do was save the Gambier Bay. Of the 6 escort carriers in Taffy 3, the Gambier Bay was the one that drew the concentrated attention of Kurita's heavy cruisers. She was hit repeatedly by 8-inch cruiser shells from the Chikuma and the Haguro. Her speed steadily reduced as flooding compromised her engines. She slowed to 11 knots, then 6, then stopped. She was struck by perhaps 35 shells in total. She capsized and sank at approximately 9:07 in the morning. More than 700 of her approximately 800-man crew survived to go into the water, where they faced a different threat: sharks, exposure, dehydration, over the next 2 days until rescue arrived. The Gambier Bay was the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire during the entire Second World War. I want to close this chapter with something that was said after the battle by one of the Japanese officers who participated in the engagement off Samar. In post-war interrogation accounts, several Japanese officers expressed something that doesn't easily translate as admiration, but comes close to it. A recognition that the small American ships had behaved in a way that had completely disrupted their tactical planning. The smokescreens, the torpedo attacks, the aircraft, the sheer persistence of ships that had no business being in that fight. All of it had introduced a level of confusion into Kurita's command that compounded the decision he was already struggling with. Because Kurita, at the moment when he seemed to have the Leyte anchorage within reach, was about to make the decision that would define the entire battle's outcome. Not the decision to attack, the decision to stop. Chapter 8. Kurita turns away. The mystery of the withdrawal. At 9:11 in the morning, on the 25th of October 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered his fleet to cease the pursuit of the American escort carriers and to reform. He then ordered a course change north. He was withdrawing. This decision, made at the moment when Taffy 3 was at its most vulnerable, when the Gambier Bay had just sunk and several other carriers were damaged and slowing, when Leyte Gulf and the transports he'd been sent to destroy lay roughly 45 miles to the south, has puzzled historians, military analysts, and naval officers for more than 80 years. It is the central unanswered question of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and I want to engage with it as honestly as I can, which means acknowledging that I don't think anyone has a fully satisfying answer. The explanation Kurita himself gave in post-war interrogations was that he had received intelligence reports suggesting a major American carrier force was closing on his position from the northeast, and that proceeding south to Leyte Gulf would expose his fleet to destruction. This explanation has a logical structure. If you believe a powerful force is approaching from one direction, advancing in another direction makes you vulnerable to encirclement, but it doesn't fully withstand scrutiny. The intelligence reports Kurita cited were, it turned out, misidentifications. American carrier aircraft from Taffy 2 had been attacking his ships, and his lookouts had apparently identified the aircraft as coming from fleet carriers rather than the slow escort carriers they actually were. He seems to have believed, incorrectly, that Halsey's Third Fleet, or a portion of it, was far closer to him than was actually the case. There's another layer to the explanation. Kurita had also received a message from Admiral Toyoda's headquarters, directing him to proceed to a rendezvous point to the north. The timing and content of this message, and whether it genuinely influenced his decision to withdraw, is disputed in the historiographical record. Some accounts suggest the message arrived after he had already decided to turn north. Others suggest it provided the cover he needed for a decision he was already inclined toward. The historical researcher trying to reconstruct this sequence is, at a certain point, working with accounts that were themselves shaped by the post-war context in which officers were explaining decisions made under extraordinary duress. Memory and institutional interest both affect testimony, even when it's given honestly. What I find more interesting than the stated reasons is the context of Kurita's physical and mental state by the morning of the 25th. He had been in continuous command since before the departure from Brunei. He had swum for his life in the Palawan Passage on the morning of the 23rd, 2 days earlier. He had watched the Musashi absorb torpedo after torpedo throughout the 24th. His flagship had been bombed. He had threaded the San Bernardino Strait in the dark. He had then conducted a running battle against destroyers and aircraft for nearly 3 hours, with ships reporting damage and his formation badly disrupted. By 9 in the morning of the 25th, Kurita had been in nearly continuous, high-intensity operations for roughly 60 hours. The physiological effects of that kind of sustained stress and sleep deprivation on decision-making are real and well documented in subsequent research, even if they weren't fully understood in 1944. There are elements of the engagement that may also have introduced genuine uncertainty about what he was facing. The smoke screens laid by the American destroyers were effective enough that Kurita never had a clear picture of the full size and composition of Taffy 3. The aggressive torpedo attacks had convinced his staff at various points that they were under attack from fleet destroyers rather than escort vessels. The aircraft attacks, improvised and persistent, created the impression of a larger, better organized air defense than Sprague actually had available. In his post-war testimony, Kurita acknowledged that his assessment of the strength of his opposition had been inaccurate. He believed he was fighting a larger, more powerful force than he actually was. That misidentification wasn't random or irrational. It was the result of his opponent's fighting far above what their actual capabilities should have allowed. The disruption to his formation was also a real problem. By 9 in the morning, his fleet was scattered across a wide area. The destroyer and aircraft attacks had pushed different elements of his force onto different courses, and reassembling them into a coherent striking force would have taken time. His heavy cruisers, which had been the main pursuit force, had themselves taken damage. The Kumano had lost her bow to a Johnston torpedo. The Suzuya had been hit by aircraft and was slowing. The Chokai had been struck and was burning. The Chikuma was badly damaged and would later be sunk by aircraft. These were real losses, and any honest accounting of Kurita's decision has to acknowledge that his fleet was not as strong at 9 in the morning as it had been at 6:45. He was winning, yes, but the cost of winning was accumulating. I've read the post-war interrogation transcripts of several Japanese officers who were present at the decision. They're careful documents, shaped by the circumstances of defeat and occupation, and you have to read them with that context in mind. What comes through in some of them, though not in Kurita's own account, is an almost atmospheric sense of a fleet that had been fighting for the better part of 3 days, and had absorbed, even in tactical success, a kind of cumulative psychological weight. One officer's account describes the feeling aboard the Yamato when the withdrawal order came as one of exhausted acceptance rather than disagreement or relief. Not celebration that they were leaving danger, not protest that they were leaving victory, just acceptance. That characterization, if accurate, tells you something about the state of Kurita's command by that morning. What remains, historiographically, is a decision that changed the outcome of the battle and possibly the course of the Philippines campaign. Had Kurita continued south for another hour, his fleet would have entered Leyte Gulf. The transports and supply ships anchored there, which Kinkaid had started to order out into the open sea, but which couldn't have cleared the area in time, would have been exposed to the guns of battleships and heavy cruisers. The MacArthur invasion force, already ashore on Leyte, would not have been immediately at risk. Soldiers on a beachhead aren't sunk by naval gunfire in the same way that ships are. But the logistical structure supporting the invasion, the supplies and ammunition and fuel and equipment still aboard those ships, would have been devastated. Whether that would have been enough to unravel the Leyte landing entirely is a question historians have argued about without resolution. The consensus seems to be that it would have seriously disrupted the campaign without ultimately reversing the strategic balance. The Americans had too many resources in the Pacific by October of 1944 for a single operational setback to change the final outcome, but it would have been very bad, and it didn't happen. Kurita turned north. His fleet spent the next several hours in the waters north of Samar, reforming and trying to establish a clearer picture of what was around them. Contact reports, many of them inaccurate, suggested enemy forces approaching from multiple directions. A strike by aircraft from the fleet carriers of Task Group 38.1, which had been recalled from the direction of Ulithi, but arrived too late for the main morning action, hit his force around noon and early afternoon, sinking the Kongo-class cruiser Noshiro and damaging other ships. By mid-afternoon, Kurita had made the final decision to return through the San Bernardino Strait and withdraw westward. He exited the strait that evening and was attacked once more by American aircraft and submarines over the following days. The heavy cruiser Noshiro was sunk on the 26th by aircraft from Task Group 38.1. Several other damaged ships were lost to submarines during the return passage. What had sailed from Brunei on the 22nd, as the most powerful Japanese surface force assembled in years, limped back to Japan and linger in fragments. The question of what Kurita's withdrawal means whether it was a rational decision under the circumstances or a catastrophic failure of nerve at the decisive moment, is one I don't think history has fully settled. I lean toward the view that it was both. It was rational in the limited sense that Kurita was working with genuinely bad information, had taken real losses, and had operational reasons to be concerned about his fleet's ability to survive the return passage. It was also a failure in the more expansive sense that the entire mission, the entire logic of Sho-Gō 1, the sacrifice of Ozawa's carriers, the deaths of Nishimura and his crews at Surigao Strait, had been oriented toward the moment when Kurita's guns could reach the Leyte anchorage, and at the moment when that was achievable, he turned away. Those two things can both be true at the same time, which is part of what makes the Battle of Leyte Gulf so resistant to clean conclusions. Chapter 9. Halsey chases the decoy, the battle off Cape Engano. While the drama off Samar was reaching its desperate peak, Admiral William Halsey was roughly 300 miles to the north, doing exactly what Admiral Ozawa had spent several days trying to get him to do. Halsey's Third Fleet, the fast carrier task groups, Willis Lee's fast battleships, destroyers by the dozen, was steaming north at flank speed toward the northern force, toward Ozawa's near-empty carriers. By dawn on the 25th of October, the trap had worked. Ozawa had successfully drawn the most powerful American naval force in the Pacific away from San Bernardino Strait. From a purely tactical standpoint, measured only by what Halsey knew and intended, the operations against Ozawa's northern force were professionally executed. First strike was launched at 8 in the morning of the 25th. The carriers that Ozawa had, the fleet carrier Zuikaku, the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, plus the hermaphrodite battleship carriers Ise and Yuga, which had their rear turrets removed to carry aircraft but which carried almost none, were within range. American aircraft hit the northern force repeatedly through the day. The Zuiho was hit and badly damaged in the morning. She sank in the early afternoon. The Chitose was hit in the morning and sank shortly after. The Chiyoda was damaged and set dead in the water. She was finished off by American surface ships late in the afternoon. The Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from the group that had struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, took multiple bomb and torpedo hits throughout the day. She capsized and sank at approximately 2:34 in the afternoon. Aboard her, according to post-war accounts, her crew mustered on the flight deck as she rolled, and her surviving officers lowered her battle flag in a final ceremony. The accounts of that ceremony, the flag coming down on the last carrier of Pearl Harbor, are part of the iconography of the Pacific War's final year. I mention it not because ceremony changes what happened, but because it illustrates something about the naval culture Ozawa's men carried with them even on a mission that was explicitly designed to end in their destruction. They were performing their duty as they understood it, on a ship they knew was never going to see home again. Ozawa's surface ships, the Is, the Hyuga, and several cruisers and destroyers, proved more difficult to sink. The two battleship carriers were hit repeatedly during the day, but refused to go down, eventually escaping northward in the late afternoon. The light cruiser Oyodo, Ozawa's flagship, also survived. Of the carriers, only the Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were sunk. The remaining surface ships of the northern force made it back to Japan, damaged but afloat. Ozawa had accomplished his mission. He had lured Halsey north and lost his carriers as expected. But the surface element of his force survived in a way that he might not have anticipated. The surface action that completed the Cape Engano engagement involved some of Lee's fast battleships and Mitch's cruisers, which had been detached to finish off the crippled Chiyoda and other damaged Japanese ships. They caught and sank the crippled destroyer Hatsutsuki, which had been covering the Chiyoda. But the big surface action Halsey had been hoping for The engagement of his fast battleships against Ozawa's hermaphrodite battleship carriers never materialized, because he had been ordered to turn south before it could develop. The order that interrupted the Cape Engano action came from Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. By the morning of the 25th, Nimitz had been following the accumulating emergency off Samar through the fragmentary radio traffic that was reaching Pearl Harbor. The plain language messages from Sprague, Kincaid's increasingly urgent requests for help, the growing picture of Taffy 3 fighting alone. All of it told a story of something going badly wrong off Samar that Halsey seemed unaware of. At 10 in the morning, Nimitz sent a message to Halsey that became one of the most famous communications of the Pacific War. In the standard padding convention of coded naval messages of that era, random phrases were added to the beginning and end of a message to prevent codebreakers from identifying the start and end of the real text. The message Nimitz sent read, "Turkey trots to water. Where's is repeat. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." The final phrase, "the world wonders," was the padding added by the communications officer at Pearl Harbor. Halsey's communications officer, when he received and decoded the message, should have identified it as padding and stripped it off. He didn't. Halsey read the message as if Nimitz was asking where Task Force 34 was. With the added editorial weight of the world wonders, he interpreted it as a rebuke, as a public humiliation from his theater commander, delivered in a message that would be logged and potentially read by other officers. The accounts of Halsey's reaction describe a man of powerful emotions who threw his cap to the deck of the New Jersey in rage. He recognized in that moment that he had made an error of some kind. The recognition was followed immediately by the decision that his critics consider the compounding error. He detached Lee's fast battleships and a carrier group and sent them south, while continuing north with the rest of his force to finish the Cape Engano action. Here is the fundamental operational problem with that decision. Lee's battleships, the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, and others, were the ships that might have caught and fought Kurita's retreating center force. But by the time Halsey detached them, Kurita had already turned north from his withdrawal point and was heading back toward the San Bernardino Strait. The geometry of the situation meant that Lee's ships couldn't close the distance to Kurita before nightfall, and the attendant risks of a night surface engagement in those waters, combined with the general tactical situation, meant that the pursuit was eventually called off. Lee's battleships never engaged a Japanese ship during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the most powerful surface strike force the United States Navy had ever assembled. 6 fast battleships in a single formation fired essentially not a single shot at the enemy throughout the entire 4-day engagement. I find that particular irony very difficult to ignore. Willis Lee had correctly identified Ozawa as a decoy. He had signaled his concerns to Halsey and been dismissed. His fast battleships had then spent the decisive hours of the battle steaming north toward carriers that were nearly empty before being sent south too late to intercept the target that actually mattered. Lee's professional judgment had been correct at every stage. His force had accomplished nothing in 4 days of the largest naval battle in history, not through any failure of his own, but because the command structure above him had misread the situation in ways that his own analysis had tried to correct. The Cape Engano action ended in the late afternoon of the 25th with the sinking of the last Japanese carriers. American aircraft losses were relatively light, given the scale of the operation, in large part because Japanese fighter opposition was almost non-existent. Ozawa's few remaining aircraft were no match for the Hellcats flying combat air patrol over 3rd Fleet. The Cape Engano strikes did what they were supposed to do from an American tactical standpoint. The problem was that the target hadn't been worth going after to begin with, and the cost of going after it had been measured in what happened off Samar in the same morning hours. Ozawa had built his plan around the hope that American command ambitions and the lure of carriers would override tactical caution. He was right. The decoy worked, perhaps better than he himself had expected. Chapter 10. The Kamikaze. A new kind of terror arrives, the 25th of October, 1944, the same morning that Taffy 3 was fighting for survival off Sama. Another event occurred that would reshape the final year of the Pacific War in ways that no one in the American fleet was prepared for. At about 7:40 in the morning, a group of Japanese aircraft approached the American escort carrier groups. They weren't attacking in the conventional sense, diving on a target, releasing their bombs or torpedoes, and pulling away. They were attacking in a way that American pilots and sailors were still trying to classify and process as the attack happened. A Zero fighter, carrying a 500-kilogram bomb beneath its fuselage, flew directly into the flight deck of the escort carrier USS Santee of Taffy 1 and didn't pull out. This was the first organized kamikaze attack of the Pacific War. The word is Japanese. It means divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that historically destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. Special attack units had been formally authorized and organized by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi at his base in the Philippines only days earlier, on the 19th of October, just before the battle began. The idea was not entirely new. There had been individual pilots who had deliberately crashed their aircraft into Allied ships in earlier engagements. But Onishi organized it into a formal tactic, with trained pilots, dedicated aircraft, and a command structure. The men who volunteered and the post-war evidence suggests that many of them did volunteer, though the pressure and context within which they made that choice complicate any simple reading of it, were organized into units with poetic names drawn from Japanese classical tradition. The first organized attack on the 25th targeted the Taffy 1 and Taffy 3 carrier groups. The Santee was hit by a Zero, and then, while still managing the resulting fire, was struck by a conventional torpedo from a Japanese submarine, a piece of bad luck that illustrates the layered nature of the threat the escort carriers were facing. The Suwannee was hit by a kamikaze shortly after the Santee. Her flight deck penetrated and her hangar set ablaze. The Kalinin Bay, already damaged by conventional gunfire from Kurita's fleet, was struck by a kamikaze. But the most consequential attack was against the St. Lo. A Zero carrying a bomb flew into her flight deck, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled and armed aircraft were stored. The resulting explosions were severe and progressive. The St. Lo sank in about 30 minutes. She was the first ship in American naval history to be sunk by a deliberate, organized kamikaze attack. The reaction among American sailors and officers to this new tactic was, in the accounts that survive, a mixture of tactical confusion and something closer to existential unease. Conventional air attack followed patterns that anti-aircraft gunnery had been trained to exploit. The attacking aircraft pulled away after releasing its weapon, giving gunners a clear, retreating target. The kamikaze didn't behave like that. Once it was committed, once it was clearly pointing at your ship on a steady approach, the only solution was to destroy it before it hit. And a Zero, in a steep dive, even an aircraft already hit and on fire, could reach a ship before it was structurally compromised enough to deviate. American anti-aircraft doctrine in 1944 had not been designed around this problem. The tactical response evolved quickly. Concentrated anti-aircraft fire at extended range, fighter combat air patrols pushed further out to engage the kamikazes before they reached diving range. But over the remaining months of the Pacific War, the kamikaze would remain one of the most difficult problems American naval commanders faced. The figures are sobering. Between October of 1944 and the end of the war, kamikaze attacks sank 34 ships and damaged many hundreds more, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. Those numbers are as a proportion of the total American naval effort in the Pacific, survivable, but the tactical and psychological problem they presented was real, and the scale of it would escalate dramatically as American forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands in 1945. I want to be precise about what the kamikaze attacks represented in terms of Japanese strategic logic, because it's often mischaracterized in popular accounts. They were not simply the product of fanaticism, though ideology and the specific pressures of Japanese military culture in 1944 certainly shaped the context in which men made these choices. They were also, at a calculating level, a response to a genuine tactical problem. Japan was running out of experienced pilots. The attrition of the previous 2 years, the Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons Campaign, the Philippine Sea, had ground down the pool of trained naval aviators to the point where conventional air attack against heavily defended American warships was producing poor results at high cost. A pilot with 100 hours of training couldn't reliably hit a maneuvering ship with a bomb. He could, however, fly directly into one. The kamikaze was, among other things, an acknowledgement that conventional aerial warfare had become too skill-intensive for the resources Japan had available. That doesn't excuse or valorize it. It explains it. Onishi himself was a complex figure, a man who, by all post-war accounts, experienced deep personal anguish about the tactic he had created and the men he had sent to die with it. He died by his own hand in the final hours of the war in August of 1945, writing before his death that he wanted to express his deep appreciation to the souls of the brave men of the Special Attack Forces, and to apologize to them and to their families for having put them to death. Whether that apology adequately measures up to the thing it was apologizing for is a question I'll leave to the reader. I mention it because it's part of the human record, and any honest account of the kamikaze has to acknowledge that the men who organized the system, as well as the men who flew it, were operating within moral conditions of unusual complexity and pressure. For the sailors and airmen of the American carrier forces at Leyte Gulf, the 25th of October was the day that one kind of war ended and another began. The old war had been dangerous and deadly enough. The new war, in which the weapon was a human being who had decided not to return, demanded a different kind of mental accommodation from those who had to stand on flight decks and watch them coming. The memoirs of American sailors who witnessed kamikaze attacks at Leyte and in subsequent operations describe the experience with a consistent quality. A sense that the normal language of combat, with its expected patterns of attack and defense, had been suspended, that something outside the usual framework of even violent human behavior had arrived. They weren't wrong. It had. The first battle of the Philippine Sea in June had been called the Turkey Shoot. Nobody was making jokes like that now. The nature of the air threat had changed in a single morning, and American naval commanders knew it even as they were still assessing the damage to the Taffy groups. The tactical lessons of October 25th would be absorbed and adapted. Radar picket ships deployed further out, more fighters on combat air patrol, new fire direction systems, but none of those adaptations would make the kamikaze threat disappear. It would be there at Lingayen Gulf, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. It would be the defining tactical problem of the last year of the Pacific War, and it announced itself on the same morning in the same waters as everything else that made the 25th of October 1944 the most consequential single day of the Pacific Naval War. Chapter 11, Aftermath and Accounting. The losses on both sides. When the guns stopped and the last aircraft had either landed or sunk, The effort to understand what had just happened began, and that effort has never fully concluded, in the sense that historians are still arguing about portions of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in ways that are genuinely unresolved. But the physical accounting could begin immediately, and it told a stark story. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been broken, not wounded, not weakened, broken in the operational sense that it could not again, for the remainder of the war, mount a combined fleet offensive action. The Japanese losses at Leyte Gulf were staggering by any measure. In terms of capital ships, 3 battleships sunk, including the Musashi. 4 carriers sunk, the Zuikaku, the Zuiho, the Chitose, and the Chiyoda. 10 cruisers sunk. 11 destroyers sunk. The total tonnage lost was approximately 300,000 tons of warships. More than 10,000 Japanese sailors died in the battle. The ships that survived, including Kurita's damaged battleships, Shima's retreating cruisers, the Ise and the Hyuga from Ozawa's force, returned to Japanese home waters or dispersed to various bases, where a shortage of fuel oil meant that several of them would spend the rest of the war essentially immobilized at anchor, unable to operate even if orders had been given. The American losses, by comparison, were far smaller in material terms. 1 light carrier sunk, the Princeton, lost on the 24th. 2 escort carriers sunk, the Gambier Bay from surface gunfire and the St. Lo from the kamikaze attack on the 25th. 2 destroyers sunk, the Johnston and the Hull. 1 destroyer escort sunk, the Samuel B. Roberts. Several other ships were damaged, some severely, by gunfire and kamikaze attack. In terms of tonnage, the American losses were a fraction of the Japanese. In terms of the strategic situation in the Pacific, in October of 1944, they were the losses of a force that could absorb them without significant disruption to its operational capacity. The human losses require separate accounting. Japanese dead numbered somewhere above 10,000. Precise figures are difficult to establish because Japanese record-keeping in the final period of the war was incomplete, and many ship logs and personnel records were lost with the ships themselves. American dead numbered somewhere around 3,000, a figure that includes those lost in the Princeton explosion, in Taffy 3's surface and air engagements, in the kamikaze attacks on the Taffy carrier groups, and in various other actions across the 4 days. Every one of those men represents the kind of individual story that a documentary of this length can only gesture toward. The son of a farmer in Kansas, the mechanic from a shipyard in Boston, the fisherman's son from Nagasaki, the rice farmer's grandson from Yamaguchi. All of them ended in the same Philippine Sea, within roughly the same calendar of 4 days, for the same fundamental reason. 2 industrial nations had decided to fight for possession of an archipelago in the Western Pacific. The post-battle analysis revealed structural problems in American command that had very nearly produced catastrophe. The Leyte Gulf experience accelerated changes that had already been developing in the command structure of Pacific naval forces. The dual command system, MacArthur's 7th Fleet and Nimitz's 3rd Fleet, operating without a unified naval commander, was recognized by virtually everyone involved as a contributing factor in the near-disaster off Samar. Nimitz and his staff spent considerable effort in the weeks after the battle working through the communications failures, the ambiguous orders, the false assumption Kinkaid had carried into the 25th of October. Whether the lessons were fully absorbed is a question that the subsequent operations at Lingayen Gulf and Okinawa would test. Halsey's conduct was scrutinized at length, both immediately after the battle and in the decades of historical writing that followed. He was not relieved. He was not formally censured. A post-battle investigation found that his decision to go north was a reasonable one, given his intelligence picture at the time, while also finding that he had not provided adequate protection for Kinkaid's vulnerable forces. Halsey himself never backed away from the decision. He defended it in his memoirs and in public statements for the rest of his life, arguing that the destruction of Ozawa's carriers removed a real threat and that the near disaster off Sama was ultimately managed. His critics, including Kincaid, who was quite pointed in his assessment in post-war interviews, were less forgiving. The argument has a quality of the irresolvable about it, in part because the outcome was ultimately an American victory, which made it harder to insist that the process was fundamentally flawed. Kurita's own post-war accounting was more reflective of a man who understood that his mission had failed, his withdrawal from off Sama. The decision that continues to generate the most historical debate was something he returned to repeatedly in interrogations and in later written accounts, but without ever fully resolving the question of why, at that specific moment, he chose to stop. The simplest reading of his accounts is that he genuinely believed he was withdrawing from a position that had become untenable due to air threat rather than from a position of near victory. Whether that belief was accurate is separate from whether he held it, and the psychological state of a man who had been in continuous high-intensity operations for 72 hours, who had swum for his life at the beginning and watched the Musashi sink at the end of the 24th, who had been fought to a standstill by destroyers and escort carriers that had no business fighting him. That state is genuinely difficult to reconstruct from the documents. Admiral Nishimura, who might have given the most detailed and personal account of the Southern forces' approach to Surigao Strait, had gone down with the Yamashiro. His decisions and his final hours are known only through the surviving accounts of others, primarily the testimony of survivors from the Sho-Gō, the one destroyer that made it back. What survives of the record suggests a man who pressed forward without hesitation into conditions that the communications blackout of his approach had left him unable to fully assess. He had been ordered to arrive at Leyte Gulf at approximately 4 in the morning of the 25th. He apparently intended to do exactly that, regardless of what he encountered on the way. The Surigao Strait records his determination and its cost with equal finality. The physical record of the battle in the Philippine Sea was visible for weeks afterward. Oil slicks marked the positions of sunken ships. Debris fields stretched across open water. Men still in life rafts were being found days after the battle ended. The survivors from the Gambier Bay, from the Samuel B. Roberts, from the Johnston and the Hull had spent over 50 hours in the open ocean before rescue ships found them. Sharks were reported at several of the survivor locations. The full toll of those hours in the water is embedded in the casualty figures, but isn't fully captured by them. The men who survived the sinkings and then spent 2 days in the sea, and who carried that experience for the rest of their lives, were part of the battle's cost in ways that don't show up in the operational summaries. The strategic conclusion was clear even before the last survivor had been pulled from the water. The Japanese combined fleet had committed its remaining surface strength to a desperate offensive operation and had been destroyed as a fighting force. The Leyte landings were secure. MacArthur's campaign would continue. The road to Luzon, and beyond it to the home islands themselves, was open, not easy. The fighting in the Philippines would continue for months. The kamikazes would exact a terrible price at every subsequent landing, and the endgame of the Pacific War was still 8 months in the future. But the possibility that Japan could reverse the course of the war through a single decisive naval engagement, the strategic premise that had shaped Japanese planning since at least the Battle of Midway, was finished. Leyte Gulf was the last attempt, and it had failed. Chapter 12. The Philippines Liberated. From Leyte Gulf to Luzon, the Battle of Leyte Gulf ended the naval contest for the Philippines. What followed was a land campaign of enormous scale and considerable brutality, a grinding, multi-month operation to retake an archipelago that the Japanese garrison had been ordered to hold at almost any cost. I want to spend some time with this campaign, not because it's a simple extension of the naval battle, but because it's the context that gives the naval battle its meaning. You don't fight a 4-day engagement covering an area the size of several European countries, and then move on to the next thing. The consequences of what happened on the sea unfolded on land, and they unfolded slowly. MacArthur's forces had gone ashore on Leyte on the 20th of October, 1944, 4 days before the naval battle reached its climax. The famous wading ashore at the Leyte beach, the announcement that MacArthur had returned, the handshake with Philippine President Sergio Osmeña. These images entered the photographic record of the war almost immediately. They were documented carefully and broadcast broadly. The symbolism of the return was real, but so was the difficulty of what came next. Leyte itself was not a quick victory. The Japanese 35th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, resisted fiercely, and the conditions on the island, heavy rainfall, difficult terrain, inadequate roads, supply problems on both sides, turned what American planners had hoped would be a rapid campaign into a slow, attritional fight that wasn't fully resolved until late December of 1944. One of the things that made the Late Land campaign harder than expected was the Japanese decision to reinforce the island aggressively after the landing. In the weeks following MacArthur's initial landings, Japanese convoys ran roughly 45,000 additional troops to Leyte through the port of Ormoc on the island's western coast. This decision, essentially the reverse of what had happened at Guadalcanal, where the Japanese had poured reinforcements into a battle they ultimately couldn't win, reflected Imperial General Headquarters' classification of the Philippines as the decisive battleground. Every soldier sent to Leyte was a soldier who couldn't be deployed to the next American objective. They were spent there in the jungles of a mid-sized Philippine island in a campaign that the Japanese commanders knew by the end of October they couldn't win. The American Sixth Army's campaign on Leyte had 3 major operational phases: the initial landings and expansion of the beachhead, the push across the island toward Ormoc Bay to cut off Japanese reinforcements, and the final clearing operations in the northern mountains, where Japanese resistance continued into early 1945. The fighting in the Leyte Highlands was among the most physically demanding of the Pacific War. Steep terrain, entering, constant rain, the practical impossibility of resupply by any means except airdrop and pack animal in the most forward positions. American soldiers and Filipino guerrilla forces, who had been operating against the Japanese occupation since 1942, both contributed to the campaign. The guerrillas' local knowledge and intelligence capacity were consistently valuable in ways that don't always appear in the operational histories, which tend to focus on named units and dated phases. MacArthur's push to move the campaign forward to Luzon, the main Philippine island, with Manila, the country's capital, was aggressive almost to the point of creating its own problems. He had originally estimated that the Leyte campaign would be effectively over by the end of November. When it became clear that Japanese resistance was going to extend well beyond that, he maintained the Luzon timetable anyway, essentially accepting that Leyte would be cleaned up by follow-on forces while his main effort moved north. The Luzon landings were scheduled for January of 1945. Some of his army commanders, particularly Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commanding the Sixth Army, were deeply uncomfortable with the compressed timeline. Kruger repeatedly sought more time to complete the Leyte operation before moving his best forces north. He was consistently overruled. The naval dimension of the Luzon campaign, specifically the run through the Leyte Gulf, approaches in January of 1945. brought the kamikaze problem that had first manifested at Leyte Gulf into brutal clarity. The Japanese committed extensive organized kamikaze forces against the invasion convoy approaching Luzon. Between the 3rd of January and the 6th, kamikaze aircraft sank or seriously damaged dozens of American and Australian warships as they transited toward the Leyte Gulf anchorage. The escort carrier, Omni Bay, was sunk. The cruisers Louisville, Australia, and Columbia were all seriously damaged. The intensity of the kamikaze campaign against the Lingayen convoy exceeded what Taffy 3 had experienced at Leyte Gulf in terms of sustained pressure over multiple days. American anti-aircraft gunnery and fighter combat air patrol were both improved over what had been available in October, and the losses were significant, but not catastrophic. The Luzon, landing on the 9th of January 1945, put 4 American divisions ashore at Lingayen Gulf against initially moderate resistance. MacArthur's 6th Army had approximately 200,000 troops committed to the campaign. The Japanese 14th Area Army, commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the officer who had conquered Singapore in February of 1942, had approximately 260,000 men on Luzon, but most of them were oriented toward a defensive campaign in the mountains rather than a beach defense. Yamashita had concluded after Leyte Gulf that the beaches couldn't be held against American naval gunfire and amphibious capability. He was saving his strength for a war of attrition in terrain that favored the defender. Manila, however, was not in Yamashita's defensive plan. He had declared it an open city and ordered his forces to withdraw. But Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding the Manila Naval Defense Force, disobeyed the order and chose to fight for the city. The resulting battle for Manila, fought through February of 1945, resulted in the near-total destruction of the city that had been called the Pearl of the Orient, one of the most beautiful cities in Asia before the war. The civilian death toll in Manila was enormous. Estimates range from 100,000 to as high as 160,000 Filipino civilians killed in the fighting and in documented atrocities committed by elements of the Japanese garrison. MacArthur walked through the ruins of Manila in late February with a visible, deeply personal grief. He had lived in the city for years, had friendships there that predated the war. The Manila he had promised to return to was gone. The Philippine campaign, measured from the Leyte landing to the formal surrender ceremony in September of 1945, was one of the longest and most costly land campaigns of the Pacific War. Japanese resistance continued in the mountains of northern Luzon until the surrender, with Yamashita's forces maintaining organized resistance, even after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had made the outcome of the war inevitable. The Visayan Islands, the southern Philippines, Mindanao, each required its own series of operations, its own casualties, its own slow grinding through defended terrain. The Leyte Gulf naval battle, for all its scale and significance, had opened a door. Walking through that door took 10 months and hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. I want to end this chapter with a specific detail that brings the operational and the human together in a way I find useful. When the 6th Army was fighting to clear the Leyte Valley in late November and December of 1944, one of the consistent problems was rain. It rained on Leyte with extraordinary persistence during those months. The weather system that sits over the central Philippines in late autumn and early winter produced rainfall that made roads impassable, airstrips unusable, and the general misery of infantry combat in tropical terrain dramatically worse than any planner had accounted for. The strategic genius of Pacific amphibious operations, the mobility, the coordination between naval gunfire and air and infantry, depended on conditions that the Philippine climate periodically refused to provide. The soldiers in the Leyte Valley in December of 1944 were not fighting in the context of great naval battles or air campaigns. They were fighting in the mud, in the rain, in terrain that looked nothing like the colored arrow diagrams in operational planning documents. That's the truth of what Leyte Gulf opened, as much as the strategic turning point it marked. Both things are real. The history is incomplete without both of them. End of chapters 7 through 12. Chapters 13, 14, and 15 continue in part 3, covering the strategic consequences of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese road to defeat, and the final reckoning of the Pacific War. Chapter 13, The Broken Sword, the Imperial Japanese Navy after Leyte Gulf. There's a phrase that appears in several post-war Japanese naval memoirs, usually translated as the fleet that had no place to go. I first encountered it in a secondary account of the final months of Japanese naval operations, and it stayed with me because it captures something precise and honest about what happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy after the 26th of October, 1944. The ships that survived Leyte Gulf, some of them great ships, historically significant ships, technically capable ships, were stranded. Not stranded in the literal sense of sitting on reefs, though some ended that way too. Stranded in the operational sense that the fuel, the aircraft, the trained men, and the strategic coherence that had made them instruments of serious military power were gone. What remained were hulls. Expensive, complex, heavily armed hulls that couldn't steam more than a few hundred miles without consuming oil that Japan no longer had reliable access to. The oil problem was fundamental. Japan's entire decision to go to war in December of 1941 had been driven, in large part, by the fear of being cut off from the petroleum reserves of the Dutch East Indies after the American embargo of 1941. The irony that Leyte Gulf had now cut those supply lines anyway, more efficiently than the embargo ever had, wasn't lost on the officers of the combined fleet, who were trying to plan future operations in November and December of 1944. The American submarine campaign against Japanese tanker traffic had been grinding away at the shipping lanes between Borneo and Japan throughout 1943 and 44. By the autumn of 1944, tanker losses to American submarines had reached the point where the flow of oil to Japan was a fraction of what strategic planners had assumed would be necessary to sustain industrial and military operations. The battleships sitting in Kure Harbor in late 1944, the Yamato, the Haruna, the Nagato, the survivors of Leyte Gulf, were consuming their dwindling fuel reserves simply by existing. Taking them to sea for any purpose other than an absolutely critical operation was a fuel expenditure that the combined fleet couldn't afford. The command structure of the combined fleet was reconstituted after Leyte Gulf, but the reconstitution had a quality of going through institutional motions. Admiral Toyoda retained his position as combined fleet commander, but what he commanded bore diminishing resemblance to the fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Carrier aviation was gone as a coherent force. The carrier divisions existed on paper, but had no aircraft and almost no trained pilots. Surface forces were reduced to the ships that had survived Leyte Gulf in various states of damage. The submarine force, which had never been used with the aggressive offensive doctrine that American submariners employed against Japan, had been attrited throughout the war to the point of limited effectiveness. The land-based air forces in the Philippines were being consumed by the kamikaze operations that Nornishi had initiated, spending human lives in a tactical innovation that was more effective than conventional attack, but that consumed irreplaceable pilots nonetheless. What strategic options remained? Japanese naval planners in late 1944 were working through a set of possibilities that all shared the characteristic of being costly, risky, and unlikely to change the fundamental trajectory of the war. The most significant of these was the continued commitment to the Philippines' defense, not because holding the Philippines could now be realistically hoped for, but because every month that American forces spent fighting in the Philippines was a month they weren't fighting in the Ryukyu Islands, or Formosa, or the home islands themselves. Delaying the American advance was achievable even without a functional fleet. It required soldiers, terrain, and willingness to absorb casualties. Japan had all three in abundance. The strategic logic of the Philippine defense after Leyte Gulf was explicitly about buying time. Time for what, exactly, remained unclear in the planning documents, but the concept of a negotiated settlement from a position of less complete defeat remained a thread in some Japanese strategic thinking through late 1944 and into 1945. The kamikaze program was, in this context, the naval contribution to the time-buying strategy. If organized kamikaze attacks could impose sufficient casualties on American amphibious forces, not enough to stop the advance necessarily, but enough to make it slower and more costly, then perhaps the arithmetic of the war could be altered at the political level, even if it couldn't be altered at the military level. American public opinion, in this calculation, was imagined as potentially sensitive to high casualties in a way that would translate into political pressure for a negotiated end to the war rather than unconditional surrender. This calculation proved incorrect. American public opinion in late 1944 and 1945 was, if anything, hardened rather than softened by kamikaze attacks. But it shaped the commitment to organized special attack operations that persisted through the final year of the war. The Yamato's final operation, her sortie to Okinawa in April of 1945, was in some ways the logical conclusion of the trajectory that Leyte Gulf had set in motion. The plan was for the Yamato, accompanied by the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, to reach the Okinawa beachhead, beach herself if necessary, and fight as a fixed gun platform while her crew participated in the land defense. She had enough fuel for a one-way trip. She carried no air cover. She was, by any objective military analysis, being sent on a mission with no realistic expectation of tactical success. A surface version of the kamikaze logic that had organized so much of Japanese military planning in the final year of the war. American carrier aircraft found her on the 7th of April, 1945, and she was sunk after absorbing at least 11 aerial torpedoes and 6 bomb hits, roughly 340 kilometers southwest of Kyushu. Of her crew of approximately 2,700 men, fewer than 300 survived. She was the largest battleship ever built. She was sunk at 35 years shy of what her designers had imagined as her operational life. The other surviving capital ships of the Japanese Navy spent the last months of the war in harbor, largely immobile. Several were deliberately beached or sunk as additional obstacles to American landing operations, a final transformation from instruments of offensive naval power to elements of fixed coastal defense. The fleet carriers that hadn't been sunk at Leyte Gulf or in subsequent operations, including the Amagi and the Katsuragi, were eventually bombed at their moorings during American carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands in the summer of 1945. The Yuga and the Ise, the hermaphrodite battleship carriers that had survived Cape Engano, were both sunk at Kure by American carrier aircraft in July of 1945. The Navy that had been the most powerful instrument of Japanese national power in December of 1941 was, by the summer of 1945, a memory preserved in wreckage and in the testimonies of surviving officers being interviewed by Allied naval intelligence teams. The submariners continued to operate through this period, though the American anti-submarine warfare capability had developed to the point where Japanese submarine patrols were increasingly costly. The older generation of Japanese naval leadership, the men who had planned and executed the carrier campaigns of 1941 and 42, was largely gone by late 1944 through death, wounds, or relief from command. What remained was a generation of naval officers trying to manage an institution's terminal decline with as much professional dignity as the circumstances permitted. The post-war testimonies of these men are, in many cases, remarkable documents, candid about failure in ways that institutional military cultures don't always encourage, and clearly shaped by the experience of having built their professional lives around a service that had been comprehensively defeated. One particular aspect of the post-Leyte Gulf period that deserves careful attention is the institutional knowledge loss that accompanied the physical destruction. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built over decades by officers trained in specific traditions of seamanship, navigation, gunnery, and tactical doctrine. Those traditions existed in people as much as in manuals. When experienced officers died at Leyte Gulf, when Nishimura went down with the Yamashiro, when hundreds of experienced petty officers and leading seamen went down with the Musashi and the cruisers, the institutional memory of how to do specific things in specific conditions went with them. The Navy that notionally continued to exist after October of 1944 was increasingly an organization that had lost the human substrate of its professional knowledge. Training new officers and ratings at the pace the war demanded was possible in principle, but impossible in practice given the fuel shortages, the disruption to training establishments, and the general conditions of industrial and logistical decline that Japan was experiencing by late 1944. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy as a functioning offensive military force had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remained was a coastal defense force, a collection of submarines conducting increasingly desperate and costly patrols, and the special attack units that would be committed to the defense of the home islands if American forces landed there. The surrender in September of 1945 found the surviving major surface ships either sunk at their moorings or so comprehensively immobilized by fuel shortage and battle damage that they couldn't have been deployed, even if the surrender hadn't come. The broken sword, to return to that Japanese phrase, had been broken at Leyte Gulf. What the final 11 months of the war produced was the slow dissolution of the pieces. Chapter 14. The men behind the battle, commanders, decisions, and legacies. I want to spend this chapter on the people, not the ships and the formations and the operational sequences. We've covered those. But the individuals who made the decisions and lived, or didn't live, with their consequences. Because the Battle of Leyte Gulf is, in one important sense, a story about the limits of what individual human judgment can accomplish when it's working against institutional structure, command ambiguity, incomplete information, and the accumulated exhaustion of years at war. The commanders on both sides were, in many cases, intelligent and experienced men. The outcomes they produced were shaped as much by the systems they operated within as by their personal capabilities. That's not an excuse for the decisions that went wrong. It's a context without which those decisions can't be properly understood. William Bull Halsey was 62 years old when the Battle of Leyte Gulf was fought. He had been in the United States Navy for 40 years, and he had spent the Pacific War as one of its most aggressive and visible senior commanders. His willingness to take offensive action, his consistent advocacy for pressing the enemy, his public persona as a combative and determined leader, all of these had made him enormously popular with the American public and with much of the Navy. They had also, by October of 1944, created something of a command culture around him in which aggressive offensive action was presumed to be correct, and caution was associated with timidity. That culture shaped the reactions of his staff when Bogan and Lee raised concerns about the San Bernardino Strait. It shaped the environment in which Mitchell chose not to push his own correct analysis to Halsey's attention, and it shaped Halsey's own reading of his orders, which emphasized fleet destruction as a primary task and gave him the latitude he needed to take the course he chose. Halsey's post-war career included a long and sometimes contentious engagement with the historiographical record of his decisions at Leyte Gulf. He wrote about it in his memoir, he discussed it in interviews, and he consistently maintained that chasing Ozawa's carriers was the correct decision given what he knew. His argument had merit as far as it went. The intelligence picture in the late afternoon of the 24th genuinely supported a conclusion that the center force had been neutralized and that the carrier threat to the north was the remaining priority. What his argument didn't fully account for was the cascading effect of the ambiguous Task Force 34 message, the failure to ensure that Kinkaid understood the strait was uncovered, and the dismissal of multiple subordinates who had identified the problem. A decision can be defensible in isolation and still be part of a broader pattern of command behavior that produced a dangerous outcome. Halsey seemed to find it genuinely difficult to hold both of those things simultaneously. That may be an occupational characteristic of successful commanders. The certainty that makes aggressive action possible also makes retrospective self-criticism structurally uncomfortable. Thomas Kinkaid was a different kind of officer, meticulous, methodical, more comfortable with planning than with the improvisational command style that fleet actions demanded. His handling of the 7th Fleet's support for the Leyte landings was professionally competent, and Oldendorf's preparation of the Surigao Strait ambush reflected well on the command culture Kinkaid had established. But the assumption he carried into the 25th of October, that Task Force 34 was guarding the San Bernardino Strait, was one he had a responsibility to verify. He had read Halsey's ambiguous message. He could have asked for confirmation. He didn't. He was operating, perhaps understandably, on the assumption that the command arrangements for a major operation had been properly coordinated. They hadn't been, and the cost of that assumption fell most heavily on the sailors of Taffy 3. Clifton Sprague, Ziggy Sprague, as his contemporaries knew him, is one of those officers whose career before Leyte Gulf gave no particular indication of what he was capable of under extreme pressure. He commanded Taffy 3 with a clarity and decisiveness that the engagement demanded. His immediate decisions, turn into the wind, launch everything, make smoke, attack, were correct and were made without hesitation in a situation that justified hesitation. His decision to use his destroyers and destroyer escorts offensively rather than simply as a screen was what has extended Kurita's engagement time long enough for Sprague's carriers to open some distance and for the tactical situation to develop in ways that prevented complete destruction. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his conduct in the engagement. He spent the rest of his naval career in distinguished if less dramatic service, retiring as a Vice Admiral. He died in 1955, before the full historiographical significance of what he had commanded on the 25th of October was widely understood. Ernest Evans, who commanded the Johnston and died when she sank, received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation described his conduct in language that the formal vocabulary of military decoration doesn't always manage to capture accurately. But in Evans's case, the language and the reality appear to align. He turned toward the enemy without being ordered to. He continued fighting his ship after being seriously wounded. He was last seen on the deck of the Johnston as she sank, waving off men who tried to help him into the water. apparently injured badly enough that he couldn't survive it. He was 36 years old. Of the approximately 333 men who died when the Johnston sank, Evans is the one whose individual choices are best documented. But the men who fought and maintained that ship through 2 hours of sustained surface engagement against ships vastly more powerful than themselves were, each of them choosing to continue in conditions that would have justified stopping. On the Japanese side, Kurita survived the battle and the war. He was interrogated extensively by American naval intelligence after the surrender and gave detailed accounts of his decision-making, including his withdrawal from off-Samar. His post-war life in Japan was quiet. He directed a navigation school for a period, lived into old age, and died in 1977. He never, in any of his public or recorded private statements, expressed certainty that his withdrawal decision had been correct, but neither did he fully condemn it. His position seemed to be that he had acted on the information available to him, that the information had been incomplete, and that the outcome was what it was. For a man who had commanded the most powerful surface fleet in Japanese history on what was designed to be a mission of strategic desperation, that equanimity, if that's what it was, is either a remarkable achievement of psychological processing or evidence of a compartmentalization that kept the question from being fully engaged. I genuinely don't know which. Ozawa survived as well. His post-war accounts of the Northern Forces decoy mission are among the most candid documents in the historiographical record of Leyte Gulf. He was entirely clear about what the mission had been, what he had expected its outcome to be, and why he had accepted the assignment. His carriers had been lost as planned. The decoy had worked. He expressed what reads as a genuine sense of professional satisfaction that his force had done what it was supposed to do, alongside grief for the men who had died doing it. He rose to become Chief of the Naval General Staff after the war, a position of enormous symbolic importance in the reconstruction of Japan's post-war maritime self-understanding, and died in 1966. The Philippine officers and civilians who experienced the battle as something that happened around them, to their island, their country, their cities and farms and fishing villages. Their perspective is the one that is most consistently absent from the Western historiography of Leyte Gulf. The battle was fought to liberate the Philippines, and Filipinos died in it and in the land campaign that followed in numbers that dwarfed the losses of any other nationality involved. The Philippine death toll from the entire war, including the occupation, the liberation campaigns, the Manila Battle, and the extended resistance fighting, numbered somewhere between 500,000 and over 1 million people, the vast majority of them civilians. That number sits behind all of the operational history, the maneuver orders, the torpedo tracks, the command decisions, like a weight that the tactical narrative can acknowledge but can't fully bear. The battle was fought for these people, and they paid an enormous portion of its cost. The historiography of Leyte Gulf has continued to develop in the 8 decades since the battle. Thomas Cutler's detailed account, Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history, C. Van Woodward's early study, James D. Hornfisher's work on the Taffy 3 action, each has added layers of detail and analysis to the record. The Japanese side of the battle became better documented as post-war interrogations were translated, published, and cross-referenced with American accounts. The picture that has emerged is not a simple story of American competence versus Japanese failure, or of brave small ships versus overwhelming odds. It's a more complicated picture of 2 institutional military cultures in collision, both of them operating under constraints and distortions that their own structures had created, both of them containing men of remarkable capability and men whose decisions nearly produced disasters. producing an outcome that was neither inevitable nor accidental, but somewhere in the interpretively difficult middle ground between those two poles. That's where honest history usually lives. Chapter 15. The Long Shadow. What Leyte Gulf meant and still means. I've been sitting with the Battle of Leyte Gulf for a long time now. Longer than this documentary. Longer than the research that preceded it. I first read a serious account of the battle when I was quite young. And what struck me then was the sheer scale of it. More than 200 ships. Hundreds of aircraft. 4 named engagements fought within the same 4-day window across a stretch of sea larger than most European countries. It felt almost too large to be a single event, more like a compressed campaign than a battle. That instinct wasn't wrong. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is, by almost every measurable standard, the largest naval battle in recorded history. That claim has been made for nearly 80 years, and I'm not aware of a serious scholarly challenge to it. But what does largest mean, finally? It means that the resources committed, the tonnage, the manpower, the aircraft, the fuel, the ammunition, exceeded those of any comparable engagement in the history of naval warfare. It means that the strategic stakes were genuinely enormous. Control of the Philippines, the viability of Japan's supply lines, and indirectly the question of whether the Pacific War would end in 1945 or extend into 1946 or beyond. It means that the decisions made during those 4 days had consequences that rippled outward into the subsequent history of the Pacific War in ways that are still being traced by historians. But largest doesn't automatically mean most important in the analytical sense. And it's worth thinking carefully about what Leyte Gulf actually decided and what it didn't. What Leyte Gulf decided, unambiguously, was the naval contest for the Philippines. After the 26th of October, 1944, Japan could not mount a combined fleet operation to interfere with American amphibious operations in the Western Pacific. The surviving Japanese surface ships lacked the fuel, the air cover, and in many cases, the trained crews to conduct sustained operations at the range required. The kamikaze program could impose costs on American forces, real, serious costs, but it couldn't stop amphibious landings once the fleet that might have disrupted them had been destroyed. The strategic pathway from Leyte to Luzon to the Ryukyu Islands to the home islands themselves was, after Leyte Gulf, a path that American military planners could walk with reasonable confidence that the naval dimension of the threat had been neutralized. That is a very large decision in the context of 1944. What Leyte Gulf didn't decide was when and how the Pacific War would end. That question was answered by a combination of factors. The continued American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping, the progressive destruction of Japanese air power through attrition, and the B-29 strategic bombing campaign, the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945, and ultimately the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th. The Soviet declaration of war against Japan on the 8th of August also played a role that is sometimes underemphasized in American accounts. It foreclosed the possibility of a Soviet-mediated negotiated settlement, one of the few diplomatic options that some elements of the Japanese government had been exploring in the final months of the war. The end of the Pacific War was determined by the accumulation of all of these factors, not by any single engagement. Leyte Gulf contributed decisively to the conditions that made the end possible. But the road from October of 1944 to September of 1945 was still 11 months of fighting, dying, and burning. The battle also decided something about the character of naval warfare that wasn't fully understood at the time, but has become clearer in retrospect. The surface engagement off Samar, the last time in history that a surface fleet threatened an aircraft carrier force, without itself being covered by carrier aviation, demonstrated in the starkest possible terms what the carrier and the aircraft had done to the traditional hierarchy of naval weapons. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was maneuvered out of a battle by a single destroyer firing torpedoes. She was eventually sunk, not by a battleship, not by a cruiser, not in a surface engagement, but by carrier aircraft at Okinawa. The era of the battleship as the primary instrument of naval power. An era that had defined naval thinking and naval spending for roughly half a century was over by 1944, and Leyte Gulf both illustrated this and accelerated the institutional recognition of it in naval establishments around the world. American battleships were already being redesigned into their post-war roles as shore bombardment platforms and carrier escorts, rather than fleet combatants before the end of the war. The lesson had been absorbed. The kamikaze dimension of Leyte Gulf has a longer legacy than it's sometimes given credit for. The organized use of aircraft as weapons in themselves, as delivery systems for the kinetic energy of a crashing airplane, rather than for the explosive energy of a released bomb. Anticipated, in a very rough conceptual sense, the logic of guided munitions and eventually of systems in which the vehicle itself is the weapon. I'm not making a direct technological lineage argument. The kamikaze and the modern cruise missile are very different things, built on different principles, used in different contexts, and separated by 8 decades of engineering development. But the operational concept of a one-way weapon that cannot be recalled once launched, that must be destroyed before it reaches its target, because it carries no survivable human decision-making aboard, is a concept that the Battle of Leyte Gulf introduced into modern warfare as a systematic tactic rather than an individual act of desperation. That conceptual legacy, at whatever remove, is part of what the battle contributed to subsequent military thinking. The question of unified command, the structural problem that allowed Halsey to strip the San Bernardino Strait of coverage without Kincaid knowing, was addressed after Leyte Gulf in ways that influenced American military organization for decades. The experience of having 2 powerful fleets operating in the same theater under different commanders who reported to different chains of command, producing a near catastrophic gap in coverage. That experience was a direct contributing factor in the eventual organizational thinking that led to the unified combatant command structure that the American military formalized in the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. It took 40 years, and Leyte Gulf wasn't the only data point that shaped the reform, but the lesson that joint operations require unified command, genuinely unified, not notionally coordinated, was one that military planners drew from the specific failure of October 1944 as explicitly as from anywhere else. For the Philippines, the legacy of Leyte Gulf's inseparable from the legacy of the entire Pacific War and the Japanese occupation that preceded liberation. The battle is remembered in the Philippines as part of a liberation story, and that framing is historically accurate. The landings that Leyte Gulf made possible did end a brutal occupation that had caused immense suffering. But the liberation came at a price that Filipinos paid disproportionately, and the physical destruction of Manila during the battle for the city in February of 1945 is a wound in Philippine national memory that the straightforward liberation narrative doesn't fully address. The relationship between the United States and the Philippines in the post-war decades, a relationship that included American military bases, political influence, and economic arrangements that weren't always configured to Philippine advantage, was partly shaped by the bond that the liberation created, and partly constrained by the power asymmetries it reflected. History rarely produces clean accounts, and the story of American and Philippine relationships in the decades after Leyte Gulf is one of the less clean ones. The survivors of Taffy 3, the men who had been in the water off Samar for 50 hours, the destroyer men who had charged Japanese battleships in ships a tenth their size, the escort carrier pilots who had made dry runs on cruisers because they had run out of ordnance, formed a survivors' association that met for decades after the war. The last of them are gone now, or very nearly. The ship that perhaps most embodied the action, the Samuel B. Roberts, has a successor, the guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts, commissioned in 1986. That ship was seriously damaged by an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf in 1988, and her crew made emergency repairs that kept her afloat and got her back to port, actions for which she was awarded the Navy Unit Commendation, a recognition that drew explicit comparison to the conduct of the original Samuel B. Roberts at Leyte Gulf. Whether that connection is meaningful or coincidental is the kind of question that history leaves to individuals to answer for themselves. I want to close this documentary where it properly ends, not with a strategic summary or an assessment of lessons, but with the physical reality of what we're talking about. The wrecks of the ships sunk at Leyte Gulf are still on the bottom of the Philippine Sea and the Sibuyan Sea and the Surigao Strait. Deep water survey expeditions in recent years have located and documented several of them. The Musashi was found by a private expedition in 2015 at a depth of roughly 1,000 meters in the Sibuyan Sea. The wreck showed the catastrophic structural damage of the sustained air attack. She had capsized and broken apart during her sinking, and the debris field covers a large area of seafloor, the Gambier Bay, the Johnston, the Samuel B. Roberts. Their wrecks were located by deep-sea expeditions in 2021 and 2022, lying in water too deep for recreational diving, accessible only to remotely operated vehicles that can transmit images to the surface. The photographs those vehicles sent back show ships in the condition that ships in deep water take on: encrusted, settled, slowly collapsing, occupied by the organisms that make a home of any hard surface in the deep sea. They look very little like the ships that fought there 80 years ago. They look like geology, but they are there. The men who died on them are, in most cases, still with them. The sea returned very few of the dead from the ships that went down in deep water. The 25th of October, 1944, is preserved in those wrecks, with a specificity that no document or memoir can match. The ships went down where they fought. The deep ocean is cold and dark and under enormous pressure, and it changes things, but it keeps them too. Whatever the Battle of Leyte Gulf ultimately means, in strategic terms, in the history of naval warfare, in the history of the Philippines, in the individual stories of the men on every side who sailed into that convergence of forces and either came out of it or didn't. What it most concretely and permanently is those ships on the bottom of the sea. Everything else is interpretation. The wrecks are fact. Thank you for spending this time with the history. If you've made it to the end of this documentary, whether you're watching at 2 a.m. with the room dark and the volume low, or in the afternoon with the curtains open and a cup of tea going cold on the desk, I'm genuinely glad you stayed with it. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is one of those events that rewards the time you give it. It's big enough and complicated enough and human enough that there's always more to find in it than you brought with you. I'll be back with more. Until then.